Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto has lightning panther summoning contract. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by A.Black.Stag, link in the description and support writer. Let's start the video. Chapter 1. Prologue. The Ghost Amongst the Leaves. Prologue. The gaze like Horfus scoured the darkened streets of Konoha. It raked across the cobbled road with its chilled sight, boring into the shadows that were cast from the crescent moon that hovered high above. The eyes snapped from side to side, scouring the surroundings for any sign of movement. A few moments passed, and yet they saw nothing. A muffled sound of irritation pierced the silent air, and a boy of perhaps 5 or 6 ran a small hand through snowy, ashen hair. Traipsing over the road and into the nearby park, the boy slumped himself into one of the park benches. He waited for a long while, feet swinging idly and eyes gazing up at the sparkling stars overhead. I can't believe each one of those might be suns, they seem so small. The thought had him squinting, as if it would possibly help in making them appear any bigger. He was perhaps halfway through identifying a constellation before a slow, somber chill began to creep its way through the desolate park. It was barely noticeable at first, a steady decline in temperature that gradually grew more and more severe until his breath came out like a cloud of steam from his nostrils. Outing, the boy tore his gaze away from the stars to glare at the spot on the bench next to him. You took your time. He blinked. And as if his eyes had been bleached, the cold blue in his eyes faded away. They shifted instead into a ghostly shade of white as the pupils shattered into a fragmented mess. The pigments in the world around him drained away as if a portrait had been soaked and the paint left to run. What was once an empty space beside him was now occupied by a figure, a man, formed from some sort of energy that almost looked ethereal in nature. Faceless, featureless, the spectral entity turned to look at him. "Sorry," came the hollow, bizarre voice. It was soft and gentle, but somehow pitched warped, even. "Not all have the rambunctiousness of youth to fuel them, little Naruto. We must appreciate the nice things in life before 'tis too late," the specter rambled on genially. Naruto rolled his eyes. "What do you mean in life? You're already dead." The figure started slightly, before rubbing his jaw with incorporeal fingers. "Am I? Oh, I didn't notice. You have all the time in the world, at least until the Shinigami comes for your head," the snowy-haired boy mused. "Ah, I'll just sick him on you instead." The child shot the apparition a mild glare. "Just you wait until I find your grave and pee on it. Touch it and I'll start playing with the light switches in your apartment just after you watch a scary movie." The muffled snort escaped Naruto, despite himself. "You're so stupid." "No you. Anyway, I need your help with that stupid technique you forced on me," he muttered, only to face palm as he found the specter spaced out and tracing out shapes in the stars with a transparent finger. "On Kami's name I'm about to exorcise you, Ghost." Ghost shrugged. "I get plenty of exercise, thank you very much." The boy's eye twitched ever so slightly before he stood and dusted off his pants. "Well, funnily enough, I haven't had mine." He began to stretch and roll his tiny shoulders before turning to the still-seated apparition expectantly. The specter snorted softly before it vanished in a streak of blue energy to reappear beside Naruto, gazing up at the firmament lazily. "This breeze is nice, perhaps you could go for a run?" he supplied innocently. Naruto's brows narrowed dangerously and the faceless entity raised a hand in mock surrender. "Ma, all this pent-up anger, you should really find yourself a girlie to work that out." The 5-year-old frowned in confusion. What help would a girl be in this instance? Ignoring the inane suggestion, he jabbed a finger at the lazy specter. "Can you just shut up and help me figure this jutsu out?" he asked, irritated as he held up a hand and began to focus. "It doesn't work properly." It took a while. Maybe more than a while. Nevertheless, eventually a ripple of white electricity shot down his arm, streaming to his fingertips in waves of pure lightning-based chakra. It was decidedly unrefined. White-hot sparks began to fly from his skin, as if metal was being burnished against a grindstone. The streaks of electricity held form over his arm for perhaps a second, encasing the appendage completely in an almost divine white glow, before it began to splutter and weaken like a dying light bulb. The child struggled, his face scrunched up in a mixture of pain and concentration, before a sigh escaped his lips as the electricity finally snuffed out with a loud sizzle. He was left with a smoking arm and the quaint smell of burnt ozone wafting through the air. The pain was immense, but he was familiar with the unpleasant sensation by now. It was like an old stain that never went away. Naruto suppressed the urge to grimace as he held up his slightly charred arm towards the ghost and shook it as if to say, "Look at this," only to curl a lip back in confusion at the sight that met him. The entity was looking at him, making various exaggerated gestures with his hands and arms, not unlike one of the mimes he had heard performed to crowds in the capital city. Naruto swore he saw a middle finger stuck up in between the motions somewhere. "What the hell are you doing?" The gestures stopped before the specter cocked its head. You asked me to help, but told me to shut up. How else am I gonna communicate to you? He asked as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Why are you like this? Superior breeding, I presume. Didn't stop you from dying. Wow. The office was dim, lit by a single candle that sat oozing wax upon a small dish resting on the large oaken desk. Behind it, by the large window that granted a beautiful view of Konoha, stood a figure garbed in the traditional dress of the Hokage. In his hands, he clutched two things. One was his pipe, which had seemingly been put out judging by the dying embers. The other was an orb, made from crystal. The orb was frozen over. A thin sheet of sleet and frost coated the outside of it, as if it had been retrieved from the heart of a glacier. The old man merely stood, glaring into the obscured frozen depths with eyes narrowed and hardened. It was a stark contrast from his normally grandfatherly expression. The air in the room seemed to shift minutely, and the cage turned his head, acknowledging the Anbu operative that had appeared in the room in a kneeling position, head bowed. With a click of his tongue he indicated for the man to rise, and the shinobi obeyed. The man stood, revealing a toned figure clad in gray armor and high-grade shinobi gear, face obscured by a white mask painted in the likeness of a dog. Report, the old cage commanded quietly. The subject wandered District 7 for several hours, with no seeming priority that could be discerned. The Anbu waited, expecting a question, but the elderly cage merely made a gesture to continue. Weasel and I followed from a moderate distance. He didn't notice our presence. I would have been worried if one of my top Anbu had been discovered by a mere child twice in a row, the old man commented. A smirk crept across his lips as the elite shinobi before him had the grace to look away, abashed. Continue. Returning his gaze, the Anbu nodded. He entered the Senju National Park, managing to bypass the Jinin guard that patrolled its walls. The Hokage frowned. How? He knew their routines, Hokage-sama. There was a pause before the leader of the Leaf turned to face his operative fully. Repeat your last, he said, his bushy brows furrowing darkly. The dog mask was unwavering. He knew when to move, what the Jinin guard did, and when they did it. The Anbu pursed his lips behind his mask, and somehow the Hokage noticed it, urging him on. He seemed almost to be conversing with someone or something. But we searched the area several times. And? Nothing, sir. He was alone. The Hokage pursed his lips before reaching down and placing the frosted orb on the table, shaking his frigid fingers subconsciously. His gaze rose back to his agent, and his eyes flicked meaningfully at the blank patch of ceramic where the other eye slot should have been on the Anbu's mask. The Anbu shook his head, understanding the unspoken question. There was no one there. The old man hummed thoughtfully before pulling out his chair and taking a seat, lacing his fingers as he stared at the wood grain of his table in thought. Very well, inform Weasel that she is to take over from here. Dismissed. There was a pause, and the shinobi before him shifted uneasily. Forgive me, Hokage-sama, however he is making progress. The bushy gray brow rose in curiosity. How long did he hold it for this time? A handful of seconds, the Hokage nodded before grunting. This may be troubling for you, however I will ask that you keep noting his progression with the white lightning, Kakashi. The Anbu saluted stoically before vanishing in a near-perfect body flicker. The Hokage sat for a few moments, his thoughts stewing in his mind before something before him caught his attention. Turning his gaze to the crystal bowl that sat lifeless on his table, he saw the frost begin to thaw. The elderly shinobi watched as the milkiness in the orb faded and glass crystallized to reveal the target that had once eluded its ancient sight. An image appeared in the orb, showing a young boy with ashen hair and cold blue eyes. His clothes were tattered and ruined, his form battered and bruised. However, the expression on the child's face was one of satisfaction as he raised his left arm and tensed rigidly. The cascading shockwave of rippling pure white lightning-based chakra flooded through the appendage. It lit up the entire limb in an incredible glow for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, sending sparks and embers flying that singed the boy's clothes and skin before it sputtered out pitifully. Naruto's arm was smoking, hideously charred. Once upon a time the elderly Cage would have been up on his feet in a heartbeat, mind-whirring with the implications of the imperfect recreation of one of the most notorious techniques in the known world. However, he had seen this many times. Naruto had been at this for the past few months now and somehow managed to avoid every single eye in the village whilst at it. It took a very, very powerful presence to exert its will over the ancient artifact on the table before him. Someone like himself, an S-ranked monster of the shinobi world. Someone was training the boy, teaching him techniques that had been lost with the deaths of their progenitors. Who? He did not know. Where? He did not know. How? He did not know. The old shinobi raised a hand and snapped his fingers, and within an instant, one of the Anbu that had been hidden in the shadows was kneeling before him. Summon Grandmaster Jaguar 2-1. Inform him that his retirement has been revoked. Konoha has need of his services once again. The messenger stiffened in what seemed to be shock before saluting crisply and vanishing with a body flicker. The old Kage grunted as he stood, pushing away from his desk to stare out the window once more, glaring out over his village, seemingly searching for something. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for, and his eyes narrowed as he watched a small figure suddenly climb their way up to one of the nearby roofs. Hiruzen watched as the individual sat, legs dangling over the edge of the building, as his head tilted up to gaze at the sky, content to wait out the night. Just like every night for the past year. Someone had dug his or her claws into Konoha's Jinchuriki, and for all of Sarutobi Hiruzen's efforts towards finding out whom, he might as well have been chasing a ghost. Chapter 1 A Black Dawn. 5 years later, ice blue eyes snapped open, seconds before a blade of blackened steel slammed down upon the space his head had once occupied. Naruto reacted instinctively. His heel stomped against the aggressor's knee, buying him the time he needed to avoid the rapid follow-up that would have gored him through the stomach. Slamming both feet this time into the aggressor's sternum, Naruto pushed the man, who he could now see was indeed a shinobi, back several feet and rolled off the tacky bed he had been sleeping in. His hand scooped up both his pillow and the kunai that had been hidden beneath it with a harried efficiency. He whirled around, shoddily deflecting 2 of the 3 sword strikes that were leveled at his head with desperate parries that jarred his hands. Hissing in pain as the heavy blade was barely subverted by his comparably tiny weapon, he was forced to duck the next swipe. His offhand flashed forwards, flicking the pillow into the face of the attacker and blocking his opponent's sight for but a fraction of a second. It was all Naruto needed. As the pillow was batted away in an almost annoyed fashion, the kunai that was following scant inches behind it slammed into his foe's skull with a dull thud. The body stood rigid for a second as the joints locked in shock before its form lost cohesion and rapidly distorted, falling to the floor in a puddle water. The air behind the boy rippled, and Naruto spun just in time for a rough gloved hand to wrap around his forehead, the fingers digging tightly into his scalp. His grimace was cut short as the aggressor's other hand raised the large sword to the boy's throat and ran it across the skin, carving through the tough muscle in the neck with putrid ease. The blackened Anbu mask, embossed to resemble the snarling visage of a jaguar, lowered to meet Naruto's dimming gaze before the dark eyes behind the mask widened minutely as the child began to glow dangerously, electricity crackling across his form with reckless abandon. The hiss of building static was the only warning the masked shinobi got before the lightning clone exploded with the sound of a ruptured gas tank. The wave of white electricity that shockwaved through the room caught the Anbu flat-footed, ripping into his torso and scorching it to oblivion before slamming into the walls and searing the stone black. The real Naruto emerged from under the bed and stood, feet splashing in the remains of the Anbu agent's second water clone. The boy's eyes glanced around calmly as he lowered onto the ball of his back foot, readying for further attacks, with his arms raised in what looked to be a conventional boxing guard. A minute passed, and still the boy stood, waiting. Nothing happened. He waited for several moments longer, the body replacement technique primed and ready to swap his form with a single small desk in the room at a moment's notice, before he lowered his hands and slowly relinquished his stance. Dismissing the amassing chakra he had been gathering, the child relaxed and took stock of his surroundings. Eyeing the mess in the room had him sighing in resignation, and with a small shake of the head, he set to work on cleaning the small chamber with an almost practiced familiarity. Instantly, his mind whirred. That was the 6th time this week did I piss the old man off somehow, or is this some sort of warning? The last time he had been driven like this, the Anbu commander himself had come to evaluate his training. What followed would likely take the top spot as one of the most grueling and demanding days in his young life. He had been laid bleeding and broken at the foot of the Anbu medical division on death's doorstep, and the commander had still found him wanting. Shrugging off the nightmarish memories of the commander's eerie silver mask gazing down at him dispassionately, he emerged from his room minutes later, dressed in the standard trainee Anbu attire. The blank black mask, stamped with the number 1, hid his features from the world as he strode through the dreary corridors that were situated deep below the Hokage tower, deeper even than the main Anbu HQ. He passed by rooms. Rooms that would once have been delegated to the most promising of Anbu recruits. The best and the brightest would have slept here once, all of them tempering their minds and bodies to prove themselves worthy of the vaunted mantle of the Black Anbu. They were all empty now, and had been for years. The Black Anbu program that had been inaugurated by the Nidaime Hokage had long since lain dormant. The super soldiers the monstrous regime had once churned out by the handfuls were either dead or long forgotten. Very few still wore the dark masks, blackened by soot and ash. And only one could claim the title of being the very bane of Naruto's existence. For 5 sodding years, this had been his home. For 5 years, he had known nothing but the snarling face of Jaguar. The boy sneered behind his mask as he continued walking. That rancid, saggy-sacked fossil. How he loathed that damnable mask and the man who wore it. His sneer was wiped from his face as he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on edge. His instincts, honed to a hair-splitting edge by a blood-stained killer from the ancient wars, screamed at him with a manic fervor to move. Eyes widening behind his mask, the boy kicked off the ground and palmed two kunai that slipped up from under his arm guards, using them to stab deep into the stone ceiling above. The stone was old, but it was enough to hold his weight as the boy hauled his body up parallel to the ground by his makeshift handholds. The large curved sword of his tormentor whipped underneath him, spinning end to end before sinking deep into the dusty wall at the opposite end of the corridor with a metallic clank. Naruto immediately dropped from his perch, landing on spry feet as he spun around and copped a solid left cross to the face. His head snapped backward sharply, just as the handfuls of shuriken he had palmed left his gloved fingers. At this distance, he couldn't hope to miss, not that his aim was that terrible either. However, Jaguar didn't play by the rules, evident as the wiry figure dispersed in another splash of water. The shuriken in his throat and upper chest fell to the ground with a clatter. Naruto wasn't fooled. He was already turning, his body twisting in the air in a forwards corkscrew as the blade from before came flying back with a vengeance, the ninja wire wrapped around its handle pulling it through the air with a dexterous grace. The blade passed scant inches from his face as he twisted over it. He could even see his reflection in the polished edge of the weathered weapon for but a moment before it flew by. The snowy-haired Anbu trainee landed in a sprinter's position on the floor, his hands flashing as he rose. Lightning release. Storm Giant's thunderclap. Hands flush in the boar seal, the ashen-haired boy spread his hands, drawing out a wide array of sizzling bolts of white lightning that arsed between the curled digits snappily. Chakra flushed from the tenketsu in his hands as he opened his palms and, with a grunt of exertion, clapped them together. A sonic boom of deafening proportions exploded from the tips of his fingers as the lightning-based chakra flooded from his hands, surging forwards in a raging wall of thunder and electricity. The figure stood at the far end of the corridor was engulfed by the condensed electrical storm within instants. The howling gales ripped limbs from bodies, and the electricity fried all the airborne pieces into chunks of blackened flesh before the technique slammed into the far wall, shattering the stone into a spiderweb of cracks. Cursing, the boy immediately fell back into a defensive, even as the mangled remains at the end of the hallway dispersed into mere puddles of water. How many more were there? The cold chill crept up the back of his neck, and it was with a relieved sigh did the boy blink, his eyes flashing a ghoulish white as he peered into the realm of the dead. Ghost was here, walking towards him with eerily silent steps. "Rough morning," came the predictable quip. Naruto didn't respond immediately, only shooting the figure an irritated scowl before glancing around warily. "Oh, that was the last one if you were wondering, I checked." With a sigh, the boy dropped his guard, his shoulders loosening up as he turned to face the apparition. "That old man is going crazy with these damned clones," he hissed lowly, striding past Ghost and towards the exit. "He's going to be gassed out of chakra by the time I get to him at this rate." Ghost snorted softly, "Heh, probably," he replied, his tone melancholic. Naruto snapped a sharp gaze onto the man, brow raised, but the specter had already looked away. His eyes were locked on the doors they were passing by. Almost as if on cue, the first scream echoed from his right. Naruto grit his teeth as the wailing began, coming from the closed, deserted trainee Anbu dorms. He kept his eyes staring straight ahead, steadfastly ignoring the screams of pain and pleas for help from the ghost stuck in the past. There was a reason why the Sandaime had abolished the Black Anbu program, and it was a justified one. He carefully stepped around door number 23, trying his best to overlook the brackish blood that began to seep from beneath the door as the hollow, tortured screams of a girl no older than he echoed from behind the door. The rhythmic, labored grunting of an older man and the wet slapping of flesh that followed in the wake of her voice had Naruto shaking his head uneasily as he pulled his side out from the realm of the dead. The sounds abruptly stopped. Ghost was no longer visible, although the chill in the air was still with him, which provided a small amount of comfort. Not that he would dare admit it to the snarky undead, ever. Naruto sighed. As much as he despised Jaguar, it was clear he had gotten rather lucky with the old Anbu, judging from the horrors that occurred in this place's prime. Leaving the atrocities sanctioned by the Nidaime behind him, Naruto pushed through a set of wooden doors. Within lay the mess room, a lounge of sorts for shinobi to loiter and socialize in. It was a junction of sorts, with one passage leading up towards the Anbu main HQ and the other leading deeper into the Black Anbu facilities. The sight of the dusty couches and tables that had fallen long into disuse had Naruto snorting softly in a twisted sort of amusement. He hadn't spent a single second longer than necessary within the lounge. There was no one else to lounge around with, after all. He was halfway through the room before a sudden flash of freezing cold ran up his spine. Halting mid-stride, the snowy-haired Anbu cocked his head to the side and finally heard the slow-burning hiss that ever so gently tickled at his ears. It was emanating from directly below his feet. Skin prickling as adrenaline flushed through his system, Naruto moved, throwing himself backwards as the ground beneath him exploded with a flash of orange and a cloud of black smoke. His back collided with the ground harshly as he was propelled by the blast, but even as his form skipped across the ground and back out of the wooden doors he had come from, his eyes flashed a formless white. Where? he whispered as he came to a rolling stop. The cold breath of Ghost was freezing against his ear. 12 o'clock, engaging now. The boy blinked, his vision coming back to that of reality just as a kunai sunk deep into the slitted eye socket of his mask with a wet squelch. The Anbu, decked in his light gray gear and a white beetle mask, pulled back immediately, yanking his kunai free from what was now part of the ruined wooden door as the black Anbu trainee's hasty body replacement took effect. The insect-masked operative spun, his dual kunai stance raised high to block the strike that had come his way, prepared for the brazen frontal assault. He was not prepared, however, for the second Naruto that glided forwards underneath the first, going low as his counterpart went high and took the beetle Anbu's guard up with him. The fist of pure white, hissing electrical energy that slammed into the inside of the aggressor's knee hit mere instants before the clone above was shanked through the throat. It had more than served its purpose. The result was ghastly. The beetle Anbu screamed as his form collapsed under his now mangled leg. Running on instincts and ingrained training as he was, Naruto didn't bother to stop the limp form of his lightning clone that slammed into the Anbu with its crackling corpse. Instead, he vanished in a body flicker moments before the deadly electrical payload detonated. The gruesome sound of meat chunks hitting the floor could be heard echoing down the hallway. Curiously, it was this sound that turned the cog in the ashen-haired shinobi's head. Did he just kill a leaf nin? He was in the middle of turning to run back to the corpse, sweat beginning to break out on his forehead before the clearing of a throat had him pivoting on the spot. White electricity sparked down his hands as he palmed and threw a kunai in the blink of an eye. There was a startled cling of metal on metal as the second individual barely parried the airborne steel. "Please stand down, 01. The female voice threw him off guard. He had been expecting the gravelly thrumming tone of Jaguar. Lowering his hands that were clenched around more kunai, the trainee Anbu regarded the newcomer. She was short, womanly though rather lacking any significant muscle definition. Bearing a lightweight reconnaissance variant of the dull gray Anbu uniform, a bird mask, and no supplementing weapons, Naruto felt his pupils dilate slightly in bloodlust. It was akin to a wolf laying its eyes upon a fattened sheep. Ranged combatant, remain wary of Genjutsu and move to engage in CQC if applicable. He decided succinctly. He then saw the thin gouge across her ceramic mask from her partial parry and amended his statement. Reaction time somewhat lacking, move to engage in CQC at all costs. Her hands were currently raised non-threateningly and her voice was level, calm even. Although, the furtive flicks of the head as she glanced at the desecrated corpse that lay in pieces behind the black mask shinobi told otherwise. Relaxing, if only slightly, the trainee Anbu took a split moment to compose himself. For the life of him, Naruto couldn't think of what to say as he stared at her. The morning had gone rather off the rails. The female Anbu, oblivious to his inner conundrum, nodded and lowered her hands. "Please follow me. The Grandmaster is awaiting your presence in the tea room," she stated quietly before turning. Naruto caught sight of her gingerly rubbing the scratch across her mask and pursed his lips sheepishly. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. Falling into step behind the kunoichi, he radiated a sense of cool aloofness, but internally, his composure was less than cohesive. Was this another test? Who the hell did he just kill? Why did this basic Anbu operative in front of him have the clearance to be down in S-rank territory? The sodden chill that hovered just over his shoulder helped to ease his nerves, if only a little. The quick shift of his eyes allowed his ethereal companion to inform him that there were no surprise attacks waiting ahead. Unless Ghost was just sticking around with him, which wasn't a ridiculous notion in the slightest. He was led through a winding series of passageways. Naruto was entirely familiar with the route, having limped down them after getting his as handed to him by an ancient black Anbu and the odd 2 or 3 specialists that were sent down to educate him. However, the particular room they were heading to had been one he had always passed by without a second thought. Not once had he ever been authorized to enter. What is going on? Soon enough, Naruto found himself stepping by the bird-masked Anbu as she unlocked and ushered him inside of the mysterious room. His eyes immediately started snapping around, drinking in the details. It was a small room, with polished wooden floors and bamboo walls lined with paintings and black tapestries. A figure sat resting on a cushion in the middle of the room, slowly laying out a jade tea set on a wooden placard with an almost reverent touch. Even though the snarling black Jaguar mask covered his features and the old dated Anbu gear left little of his body exposed, Naruto could see the years lining the man's form. But skin that showed was weathered and leathery. The long dreadlocks that fell from his scalp were gray and frayed. The Anbu shifted, revealing the steel spike for a right leg that had been severed at the ankle during the Second Great War. It too had succumbed to the decaying touch of time, evident by the accumulated rust. Naruto drew a heavy breath before steeling himself. His back straight and his gaze facing ahead over the top of the kneeling black Anbu, the Anbu in training approached with quiet measured steps. Humming to a halt a few paces from the cushion laid opposite Jaguar, Naruto bowed deeply, a gesture of deference. He may have disliked the old warrior immensely, but dislike did not equate to disrespect. The decrepit-looking shinobi before him was once an S-ranked assassination specialist, with 3 confirmed S-rank kills and an unmatched single-cell parameter mission record. Age may have dulled his skills and sapped him of his S ranking, but he was still a Black Anbu and one of the most dangerous killers the Land of Fire. The Jaguar mask tilted upwards, as if noticing the small Anbu stood across from him for the first time. 01. He murmured, his aged voice distorted and warped by the synthesizer in the mask. You're early. Rising from his bow, the boy nodded but said nothing more. Before we begin, please dispose of the security breach standing behind you. There was a startled shuffle of movement behind him, but the Hokage said. Whatever the bird-masked Anbu had been about to say was rendered void as her head suddenly snapped to the left at an unnatural angle. The crunch of bone was muted by the sound of smashed porcelain as the bird mask was shattered, revealing a face that would have once been considered quite comely. It was now hideously disfigured. Her jaw had been smashed gruesomely to the side and left hanging on by a bruised tendon, courtesy of Naruto's spinning backfist. Her body crumpled to the floor, folding in on itself like a deflated balloon. Thud. The kunai slammed into her limp skull. Just in case. Grunting in apparent satisfaction, the elder Anbu gestured to the cushion mat laid on the opposite side of the small tea set that separated the two. His old hand shook ever so slightly as he laid down an empty saucer for the boy. Blinking in slight confusion as he rubbed his sore knuckles, the trainee nonetheless complied. Despite the fact that he had just murdered yet another Konoha shinobi in cold blood, Naruto was more floored by what was happening in front of him. Jaguar, the menace, the man who tormented him for 5 years, the monster under his bed, was pouring him tea. Naruto's icy eyes never left the aged shinobi, even as he bowed his head and took the offered cup in his gloved fingers. There was a pause for a moment as both masked Anbu held the steaming brew in their hands before Jaguar finally stood, knees creaking as he did so. The large ancient sword on his back clanked against his armor as he walked away to observe one of the paintings. Immediately, the snowy-haired initiative reached into a tiny side pouch stitched into his gloves with a finger and slipped out a swab. He dipped it in the tea hurriedly before concealing it within his palm, eyeing the older Anbu's back all the while. At ease, recruit. Your toxicity resistance would make poisoning you a hassle I would rather not deal with. The tea is safe. Naruto froze slightly, a deer in the headlights. A glance at the chemical swab revealed that it was indeed safe. Blinking owlishly, he detached his mask and took a sip before immediately clicking it back into place. None knew the face of a Black Anbu. Not even a rookie one. The old man barely even got away with sending clones after him in his sleep. Silence reigned for a long time as Jaguar just stared at the painting with ancient eyes. Minutes passed, maybe even an hour before finally the old assassin spoke. Scarab 3-5, he began, close combat assault unit, age 31, C-ranked Nin of Anbu platoon Charlie, attached to squadron 5. He drilled out in his slow, mechanical drawl. Naruto stiffened. And Ibis 3-5, supplementary specialist, age 19, C-ranked Nin of Anbu platoon Charlie, attached to squadron 5. Jaguar glanced over his shoulder to stare at his apprentice. Were executed this morning, on the grounds of treason. The snowy-haired Anbu's eyes widened behind his mask. Wait, what? His exclamation was cut short as a kunai came hissing over his head, forcing his mouth shut. Fingers still extended from the casual flick over his shoulder, the elder Anbu turned around to fully face his now silent apprentice. Disregarding that disappointing horror entirely, he gestured dismissively towards the scattered corpse of Ibis. You killed Scarab rather quickly. It seems that he underestimated your capabilities. Naruto simply stared at the man, unaware of whether the older shinobi was awaiting a response. He's an idiot then, as well as a traitor. An Anbu is a threat to be taken seriously, no matter their age. The Jaguar mask tilted down to regard the boy curiously. Do you know what day it is? Wednesday? The sarcastic reply almost slipped from Naruto's mouth, but he bit down hard on his tongue to hold it in. Instead, he shook his head. The kunai bounced off his mask, handle first. It's Wednesday, you stupid child. A vein popped in Naruto's forehead. But it is also our 5th-year anniversary. The synthetic drawl of the mask made the statement sound almost like a threat. How cute. Naruto cocked a brow. Cute wasn't a word that was supposed to be a part of Jaguar's vocabulary. The man was the very antithesis of the word. As you say, sir. He replied neutrally. The Black Anbu cocked his head to the side and snorted softly before reaching behind his back. Naruto immediately tensed for the incoming blow, preparing to dodge just in case the old man threw his sword or something else just as ludicrous at him. Nothing came flying at his face. Instead, the Black Anbu unclipped a mask from his belt. It was an old thing, lined with scars that shone silver in the light of the sconces on the wall. Naruto recognized the mask, though he had never seen the old man take it off from his waist. The elder seemed to stare at it for a second before, with an indiscernible murmur that Naruto couldn't quite make out, he tossed it forwards lightly. The ashen-haired Anbu caught it easily before turning the thing over. The black, scarred face of a panther stared back at him, its lidded eyes leering at him with an intensity that felt somehow alive. He glanced up and found the black Anbu across from him regarding him silently, now holding his steaming cup of tea. "It belonged to one of my squad mates, Panther 2-1. He stated gruffly, however the bite in his voice was curiously absent. "It is yours now." Naruto's eyes widened as he snapped his head up to stare at his mentor. "Does this mean yes and no? Normally, you would be assigned to other Black Anbu trainees to act as a team before you earn your masks however." He gestured to the empty room with a hand. Naruto nodded. The implication was rather obvious. "Which means we're done here, report to the Hokage's office for further instructions." The Anbu placed his teacup, which was now somehow empty, back on the wooden placard. He stepped around the boy and over the girl's corpse, heading for the exit. "Finish your tea, burn everything in your quarters." His gloved hand paused on the way to the door. "Oh, and Panther." Naruto blinked. Turning, he faced his teacher, Panther mask gripped tightly in his hand. "Sir?" The old man stared at him. "Don't you dare bring shame to that mask." The icy-eyed Black Anbu, no longer a recruit, swallowed thickly before inclining his head. "Sir." Jaguar's gaze remained for a moment longer before he grunted. He left, his grey dreadlock swaying with his movements before he vanished in a haze of ash. Naruto watched him leave before his eyes returned to the mask in his hand. "Panther, huh?" He shivered as a rakish chill suddenly brushed over the top of his head. He blinked, the color in his eyes dying to a pure white. Ghost was, as expected, trying to ruffle his hair even though the dead man's hand was somewhat fading through the top of Naruto's scalp. "See, I always said you'd make it. I'm pretty sure you told me to give up and jump off the nearest cliff once." He muttered acerbically, even as his heart swelled with pride as he stared at the black, abused mask. "What? No way, you must have misheard me, I said it at least twice." He seemed to ponder something as he continued poking ineffectually at Naruto's head. "Man, gonna miss that old bastard. Remember when he poured hot sauce into your pee hole because you forgot to?" And like that, the pride slipped away as the boy blinked quickly, the color coming back into his eyes as he shot an annoyed glare at where he knew Ghost was. "Yep, that's enough out of you." Reaching up, he pulled off his trainee mask and tossed it to the side before bringing the panther mask to his face. It snapped in place with a satisfying click and immediately the properties of the Anbu mask came into effect. His vision glowed yellow before focusing to an even sharper crystal clarity. The air filters in the mask engaged with a pneumatic hiss before growing silent as it detected no harmful substances. The seal imbued into the inside forehead of the mask began to painfully sear a summoning matrix into his skin. "Wait, what?" Naruto's eyes widened in shock moments before his form vanished in a puff of white smoke. Land of Fire, Konoha, Hokage Tower, Hokage's office. Smoke wafted lazily from the end of the old wooden pipe, the tobacco within it gently burning away into dull embers. The old Kage let out a breath of fumes from his nostrils before removing the pipe from his mouth and turning to eye the short, though no less dangerous Anbu kneeling before his desk. "Stand, old friend. Those craggy knees aren't spry enough for ceremony these days." He intoned, his words light, but his tone heavy. The ancient shinobi before him was likely more than incensed with him. The Black Anbu rose, and the dilapidated Jaguar mask rose to meet the Hokage's gaze. "You soil the legacy of the Black Anbu with this order, Hokage-sama." Jaguar shook his head. "His training is not complete." Hiruzen masked his displeasure as he glanced away, looking towards the Hokage monument. He had abolished Tobirama's disgusting program out of outrage when he had taken the mantle of Kage, even scoffed at the excuse that it was necessary. He snorted derisively. Sod the gods of irony, here he was guilty of doing the same damn thing. Did he have a choice? No. Word was spreading fast, and the news of a young, untrained, unsheltered Jinchuriki would just be blood in the air that would bring the wolves running. Had someone powerful enough to avoid every means of detection nearly stolen Naruto from under Konoha's nose? Yes. Was it expected of him as Kage to train the village's Jinchuriki into a force to match and dwarf others of his own kind? Yes. Was he ashamed that he had not the resolve to see this through to the end and bear the guilt of creating a monster for the rest of his life? Yes. Sarutobi Hiruzen ignored this however, pushing it away into the dark recesses of his mind. He nodded solemnly, acknowledging the man's words. "I know." His eyes rose to meet the Black Anbu's before him. "I know it's a lie, regardless, I couldn't stand by and watch anymore. I've had enough of committing atrocities and hiding beneath the thin excuse that is the greater good." Jaguar cocked his head to the side and stared. Eventually, he shrugged. "You've grown weak." Hiruzen smiled fondly. "All men have a weakness. You're not a man. You're a Kage." The Sandaime had no reply to that. Instead, he changed the topic. "His training is not wasted, I assume?" Jaguar scoffed in response. "Are you trying to insult me?" At the Hokage's irritated stare, he shrugged again, poking at the wooden floor with his spiked foot. "He's no Black Anbu by any means, but he's good." was all he gave. Hiruzen hummed softly. Good in Jaguar's eyes was likely prodigal in the eyes of others. A displeased frown crested his features as the word echoed in his mind. Prodigy, he hated the word. It meant nothing. I gave the run to Kemi's old mask. The Black Anbu suddenly stated. The Hokage's frown disappeared as his brows rose in full-blown shock. He stared at the Grandmaster of the Black Anbu, coughing slightly as he tried to speak. Jaguar just sighed as he waited for the Hokage to regain his composure. I never imagined you giving up that contract. Jaguar snorted, his hand falling to where his old partner's mask had rested by his hip since the day she died. He is a half-finished project, a half-made monstrosity. He deserves to be made whole. The old assassin looked away. I believe him capable of earning her mask at some point. The man then cocked his head. If he isn't eaten, that is. The aged Cage nodded absently, taking a deep drag on his pipe as he turned to glance out over Konoha. A half-made monster. I wish I had never called on you. Hiruzen admitted softly. I wish you had just died off and faded into myths, like the rest of your kind. Jaguar just stared at his Hokage. A long time passed before he eventually shrugged once again. I am well aware. He said. You are not alone in the sentiment. The Sandaime removed a pipe from his mouth, no longer in the mood for it. I shall not call on you again, old friend. I somehow doubt that. The elderly Cage closed his eyes, a tired breath escaping his lips. You are not alone in the sentiment. You are dismissed. The air in the room barely even shifted, and subconsciously the Hokage noted for not the first time just how deadly that man was. If Iwa had stealth specialists anywhere near that level of skill, he may not have held the title of Cage for so long. Location unknown. Naruto reappeared in a plume of white smoke and immediately moved. He flashed to the side faster than he ever had, the ground cracking slightly from the sheer force exerted upon it. Hunkering down in some foliage, the rookie Anbu took a long moment as he scanned for threats. Minutes passed before Naruto rose to his feet. Brows furrowing in consternation, he glanced around in a baffled sort of wonder. He was in a jungle. Vines wrapped around every tree and looped through the canopies like green snakes. Strange-smelling flora littered the floor, and mushrooms in clumps as large as his head grew at the base of trees that were thicker and wilder than even the ones in the forest of death. I have a feeling that this isn't the safest place to be right now. No sooner did those thoughts come back to bite him as he suddenly found himself pressed against the trunk of one of the giant trees, his breath frozen in his chest. Scuttling past by mere inches, a centipede as large as one of Konoha's main roads skittered across the jungle floor, heading for the dissipating smoke from the summon. Swallowing thickly, Naruto glanced up the length of the tree looming directly above him. Perhaps he would be able to gain some sort of vantage point. The hot damp air stuck to his clothes, wetting and pressing them flat to his skin as he climbed. Eventually, he crested the canopy surface and emerged above the thick blanket of trees, and his eyes widened at the sight that met him. Jungle, just endless jungle dotted with mountains and swamp lakes as far as his enhanced eyes could see. He was not in the land of fire anymore, that was for sure. Am I even in the elemental nations? The thought made him uneasy, but it wasn't exactly far-fetched. Not a single region could boast a climate like this, and a place this large would have to be on a map somewhere. Naruto stiffened as something shifted below him. Crash. The top of the tree he had been surveying from was obliterated. Naruto landed harshly on a branch of another tree as he stumbled out of his body flicker, his feet slamming into the wood and cracking the bark. However, whatever it was that was chasing him was fast, deathly so as a very large weight slammed against his tree mere instants after him. Replacing himself with a boulder that he could see down on the jungle floor, the Anbu immediately took off in a sprint, feet pounding like jackhammers against the damp ground. It would make sense that something that could nearly match the speed of his body flicker would likely far outclass him when it came to just his basic foot speed. Naruto hadn't quite made that connection, as that something suddenly slammed him face first into the ground after he had made perhaps 10 paces, pinning him down with an impossible strength. The cloud of dust settled just as a fuzzy, ticklish sensation brushed up against his ear. State your name and business here. Man should not walk these lands. The voice that spoke was deep and guttural, yet somehow strangely polite. The very pitch of it seemed to rattle Naruto's ribsage. Naruto groaned into the earth, his voice muffled as his face was pressed into his mask, and his mask pressed into the dirt. The pressure on his back eased, and the boy was able to wriggle around to rotate and face whatever it was that had slammed him into the ground. He promptly recoiled in shock, only to wince as the back of his head bounced off the ground. The giant black panther as large as a house was pinning him to the ground with a single paw. Its huge regal head stared down at him with yellow, near auburn-slitted eyes that reeked of intelligence. Naruto opened his mouth before a terribly sharp sensation pricked at the edge of his throat under his mask. A quick glance downwards revealed to him that the giant feline had unsheathed its claws. It leaned down, eyes dangerously narrowed as it stared at the mask covering Naruto's face. That mask, it does not belong to you. Explain, if you would, and quickly. Naruto edged away from the tip of the claw against his throat. It was given to me. He wheezed, the air escaping through his vocal cords a tad too fast as the giant paw on his torso pressed down harder. No complaint left his lips, however. Naruto was just happy that the creature hadn't turned him into paste yet. The giant feline's eyes narrowed in response. By whom? Electrical chakra began to pool up in Naruto's hand as he placed it against the soft pads on the underside of the creature's paw. An Anbu of Konohagakure, Jaguar 2-1. The creature's eyes widened before it looked away, apparently in thought. It was all the opening Naruto needed. It was almost ludicrous that the beast didn't sense the incredible amounts of lightning chakra he had summoned up, and it was incredibly lucky that Jaguar had decided to expand on his strangely mutated control over a notoriously finicky element. He pressed his right hand firmly against Feline's fleshy pads and discharged it all. The effect was immediate. Literal shockwaves of pure white electricity tore through the feline's entire body like a lightning rod. The giant cat reeled back, its facial features contorting weirdly and its huge limbs spasming as tens of thousands of volts of electricity shocked through its body. A rather bizarre wheeze left its throat as it slumped to the jungle floor and Naruto immediately bolted. His form flickered, sifting away into streaks of ash and cinder as he utilized the body flicker technique repeatedly, only coming to a pause just after he nearly splattered himself against a tree. Panting softly, the boy sank to his haunches against the smooth bark and let his head conk back against the tree. His body was on fire and he swore he could feel the cells in his body committing suicide one by one as his muscles cramped painfully. He consoled himself in the fact that at least he didn't have to bother worrying about his chakra consumption. How the hell did that Uchiha prodigy manage this? He shook his head wearily, thinking of the disastrous event that had culled nearly half of Konoha's strongest clan. Breathing deeply and heavily, the boy dragged himself to his feet. He had to get a move on. He had packed quite a lot of juice into that touch-based technique, but it likely wasn't rated for something that weighed several tons. It would recover soon, and as he had already learned, the thing was damned quick. He turned around, somewhat recovered and ready to move when a shadow suddenly stepped over him, soundless. The shape was, unfortunately, familiar. Naruto blinked and turned slowly. The furious orange eye was glaring him dead in the face. The once thin, shiny coat of fur was now fluffed up and spiky, the edges singed and burned. How the newly instated Anbu murmured. Before he turned around and promptly began walking away. He made it 10 feet before his world suddenly went black. Sometime later, he was dropped roughly to the floor, his form fell sprawling across a bed of what looked to be dried, crunchy leaves before he rolled to his feet and immediately took stock of his surroundings. They had traveled for perhaps half an hour after he had awoken from it. He was miles from where he was now, evident by the positively colossal jungle tree that he was staring at, one that he hadn't been able to see from his earlier scan from the treetops. He was stood at the base of said behemoth in a large clearing that was littered with varying-sized felines. Some were cubs, as tall as his knee and inquisitive as they approached to sniff at him, only to be yanked back by their larger mothers. Others were positively huge, lounging on giant vines or branches as they stared curiously at him. An enormous form landed in front of him from above with not a single sound, larger even than the beast that had brought him here. Its shoulders hiked up to absorb the impact and sound of the fall, before its large, scarred head came down to inspect the small boy as its long tail whipped around behind it. It stared at him before its eyes narrowed at the sight of the mask Naruto wore. This looks like it's becoming a regular theme around here, the Anbu mused quietly, deciding whether or not he should just take the damn thing off. Why have you brought this little thing here, brother? It wears the face of death. Its voice was low, guttural, and angry. Naruto instinctively prepared himself, his eyes that were hidden by the mask flicked towards the cubs. He may need some leverage if this went south. Why the fuck did that old cripple send me here? He felt a shadow crawl over his form as the brother to the larger panther stepped forwards and stood over Naruto. Precisely for that reason, Akui. The creature glanced down, staring at the human beneath it. Akemi-sama's partner gave this one death's face. Akui's snout curled back in displeasure, revealing ivory fangs that were as large Naruto was tall. So you though to bring it here, the beast roared its final word, sending spittle flying as a deranged look entered its eyes. The sound shook the very air around Naruto as the boy instinctively stepped back, bumping into the giant paw behind him. You seek to lead us to our graves, like our father and brother before us following that human bitch to their deaths. We are not tools for these. Whatever the fuming beast was going to say, it was cut off as something large, fuzzy, and white as snow wrapped around its throat like a noose. Naruto glanced up in surprise and promptly gawked in awe. Am I even awake at this point? Another panther, this one as albino as they came, was glaring down at them all with its ruby red eyes. It was a gargantuan creature, dwarfing both beasts currently surrounding Naruto. The Category 5 summon. A devastating beast capable of turning the tides of war with its very presence. Konoha itself, even as one of the greatest villages, once held 3, but now could boast only one of the legendary contracts. Naruto vaguely remembered Jaguar saying that those capable of summoning category 5s were immediately listed as S-ranked in the bingo book and were often called upon to combat the Bij themselves. Staring up into those giant eyes, Naruto couldn't help but agree with the notion. Naruto turned his attention back to Akui, the category 3 summon's eyes were bulging, the whites beginning to become bloodshot. He was strangled for a few moments more before being roughly tossed to the side as if his weight meant nothing to the creature above. The category 5 loped down from its perch, again landing with barely any sound when something of such size should have rattled the entire forest. Almost immediately, Naruto could see the lithe form of the creature before him and the choked plea of mother from Akui now made sense. "I've told you repeatedly not to speak of ill of Akemi-chan, your father would splay your hide for such disrespect." It hissed. Its voice was soft but thrummed with a sort of resonance that cowed every feline in the clearing. The large white head turned towards Naruto. The colossal panther stared at the comparatively ant-sized human for a long moment before its snout quirked in what could be regarded as amusement. Its pink nose wriggled cutely as it raised a giant paw and squashed Naruto. Akui and the beast that had brought Naruto here looked on in shock, as did the other panthers in the clearing, before a muffled electrical burst popped out from the sides of the pure white paw as the lightning clone was dispersed. Mirthful ruby eyes turned upwards to the trees, to where Naruto had perched himself. "Cheeky little thing," it tutted admonishingly. "Come here and say hello, won't you?" Naruto restrained his urge to sigh. He was very much out of his league, it seemed. Knowing that fleeing would result in nothing productive, he dropped lightly into the clearing, pointedly avoiding the unreadable stare of the panther behind him, who was clearly trying to figure out when the swap had occurred. The recently christened Black Anbu faced the category 5, staring into its ruby eyes with an air of confidence he didn't quite feel. Somehow, he managed to remain completely still as it slumped down into a more comfortable position, muzzle resting on its paws as it studied Naruto with curious eyes. Placing his hands behind his back in a formal stance, he bowed his head. "Black Anbu Operative 0020, designation. Panther, currently unassigned to either a platoon or squad." He replied succinctly. The albino beast's brow perked up. Akemi-chan was 0019, some odd 15 years ago, the confusion was obvious. The Black Anbu program was absolved by the Sandaime Hokage at the start of the Third Shinobi War 15 years ago, before the Yondaime was instated. Naruto supplied, careful to keep his voice neutral. The whiskers twitched in quiet thought before it sniffed, eyeing Naruto. The question in its eyes was rather glaring. "If that is true, then why does another stand before me?" Naruto just shrugged. He knew of his status and what he was. Jaguar had sat him down and informed him on the very first day, breaking his existence down to pieces and leaving no room for wayward emotions. Whether these creatures were privy to such knowledge, Naruto knew not. The colossal feline cocked its head to the side, pink ears perking slightly. "You do understand your predicament here, do you not, little cub?" The muscles in Naruto's back bunched up in tension as he readied himself for a body flicker. "I do. And you would still refuse to give answer?" The icy blue eyes bored into ruby red, the resolve in them as firm as a glacier. "I would." The albino's eyes narrowed and its muzzle edged closer. Naruto did not yield, he stood there resolutely as a mouth big enough to stuff dozens of persons, his size stopped scant inches from his own face. "Not yet," he murmured inwardly. "She's too close." Naruto yelped in surprise as the giant cat snorted in apparent amusement. The blast of hot air from its pink nostrils had nearly knocked him clean over. Resolve like that is a welcome sight, especially these days. Naruto blinked. "Huh?" The greater summon's eyes shifted distastefully to where her offspring was curled up by the foot of the giant tree, hiding his sore neck and sulking quietly. Her gaze turned back to Naruto. "So be it. I am Ikta. I currently serve as the matriarch of the panther summons of Konohagakure no Sado." She glanced up to the jet black feline still stood behind Naruto. "The oh so mighty protector of our forest who brought you here is my third born, Kete." Her brow perked up as she took in her offspring's appearance. "Who apparently needs to relearn and how to groom oneself." Kete huffed softly at Naruto as the boy gave him a mediocre wave, again almost bowling the small shinobi over in doing so. He then turned his head to the side and gestured to several of the larger females who loped over and immediately began preening his fur, all of whom were staring at Naruto in curiosity. "That brute is my second-born, Akui." Naruto nodded at the scowling beast, unfazed by the glare he received. "Which one is your firstborn?" The clearing grew silent. Kete ceased his grooming, tongue still halfway through slicking his fur back into place. Ikka's eyes grew distant as she answered. "Dead," came the monotone answer. "Along with my mate. They fell in the Great War, alongside the previous holder of the contract." Her eyes locked onto Naruto's mask. "And that mask?" Naruto nodded slowly, Akui's disposition towards him now making some sense. His fingers reached up to trace the scars that lined the panther mask on his face. Ikka noticed the action, a wistful look entered her eye. "Why are you here, little cub?" Snapping back to the present, the boy glanced around. Every single slitted eye was trained on him like dozens of laser beams. Turning back to the matriarch, shook his head. "I finished the program, the only recruit and only graduate under the tutelage of Grandmaster Jaguar 2-1. He gave me this as my mask." A gloved finger tapped on the blackened ceramic. Ikka inhaled softly, "Jaguar Akemi-chan's mate." Naruto's jaw dropped in utter shock. "Mate? Is this his wife's mask? I never saw much of this Jaguar Hikori, my mate was Akemi-chan's personal summon, not I," she informed quietly. "However, I knew she loved him. Perhaps even enough to sacrifice herself and two of our best." Naruto's frowned. "Sacrificed against their will?" She snorted fondly. "Of course not," came the amused reply. "Hikori was pride incarnate and Ikki, he was courage. They would rather suffer 1,000 deaths than let their beloved summoner go out alone. They lived up to their names, none would doubt that." Her smile faded as she glanced at Naruto and the mask that adorned his face. "Have you come to take more of my family from me, child of the leaf?" Naruto bit down on his lip, his mind congested. The addition of a category 5 summon and several high-class summons such as Kete and his brother would be a tremendous boon to Konoha. It would be treason to hide such a monstrous war asset. Yet Jaguar had kept the contract with him all these years. He wouldn't have done so without the Hokage's consent. Naruto glanced to where Akui laid, his orange eyes filled with anger and sadness. His eyes locked with that of the matriarch's. She was awaiting his reply. "Yes," he whispered in his mind. "No," was the lie that came out of his mouth. The beasts would serve his village. He would make them, but this was a game to be played slowly. Ikka's eyes widened. Whispers began to spread through the clearing as he stepped back towards Kete's motionless form. "I am a Black Anbu of Konoha. I am their hands, their eyes and their weapon. I have no other fate, but I am no slaver." Lies. "I will be whatever I need to be. If I must fight and die alone." The ashen-haired Anbu's eyes hardened as he ran through a selection of hand seals. "Then so be it." His hands ended in the ram seal before he pressed his palm against the panther mask. A glowing sealing matrix spread across the war-forged mask and over the skin of his face too as the summoning technique took effect. He idly noticed Kete rising from his haunches, mouth open to say something as Akui snarled in disbelief. However, his eyes were locked on Ikka's bewildered face as he vanished in a cloud of smoke. He reappeared back within the tea room in another burst of white vapor. Immediately, a frosty chill settled over the entire room, its presence seemingly dwarfing all others as the temperature dropped. Naruto raised a hand, offering a lazy thumbs up as he let go of the breath he had been holding. He was thankful that the summoning matrix in the mask, or in his face rather, was two-way. Or else he might have looked rather foolish, still stood in the jungle with his hand slapped against his face. His sight shifted and Ghost appeared before him. "What the hell happened?" the specter questioned. The usual levity in his tone was remarkably absent. Naruto shook his head. There was a summoning contract written into the mask, a panther contract. The specter seemed surprised. "Panthers? Kumo has the panther contract, not Konoha." Naruto gave Ghost a cynical stare. "I knew it. You were shinobi, you shitting liar." Filing away his triumphant deduction, he sniffed airily in response, making for the exit. "I'm not so sure about that, I saw a category 5. Bullshit." The ashen-haired Anbu just shrugged. "A cat 5, 2 cat 3s and a bunch of smaller ones. But they won't accept the contract." The Ghost turned an inquisitive glance on the child and Naruto sighed. "The operative before me got both their previous boss and heir killed. They're understandably a bit testy now." He stopped suddenly, pausing as he passed by his old mask on the floor. His eyes were drawn to it, like moths to a flame. The pull was almost unnatural. Normally, you would be assigned to other Black Anbu trainees to act as a team before you earn your masks. The pale number 1 painted onto the forehead of the mask seemed to stare at him, almost in disappointment. Reaching up, Naruto detached the panther mask from his face and flipped it around to look at the snarling visage. "Have you come to take more of my family away from me?" A sudden feeling of melancholy hit him like a freight train. Had he truly earned this? It all felt unfinished. He was no Black Anbu. He couldn't even hold a candle to Jaguar. "Don't you dare bring shame to that mask." Stooping down, the young shinobi picked up his old mask. Ghost stepped up next to him, his featureless face watching him stoically. "What's wrong?" Naruto snorted softly, without mirth as he held both masks in his hand. "I can't shake the feeling that I've gotten by on technicalities," he muttered. "If Jaguar truly trusted me to wear this mask, why would he bother with his warning?" Ghost watched him for a moment longer before his voice, devoid of its usual snarky humor, echoed through his mind. "By that logic, he probably doesn't think you're ready." Naruto nodded. "Black Anbu are supposed to pose a threat to Kage." There was a pause. "Yeah, maybe put your old mask back on." It was like a punch to the stomach. The pride he had once felt was long gone, replaced instead by the rancid feeling of disappointment and self-doubt. Was it the Hokage? The man had a fetish for meddling in everything. Naruto could remember the Anbu tailing him day in day out at what was likely the old man's behest. He still remembered their masks, having caught at least two of them. Weasel, the female operative, short and young. He had quite liked her. She didn't bother hiding and kept her distance. He had made it a point to always visit a stand that sold poke so she could nab her favorite snack whilst on duty. She seemed to appreciate the sentiment. And Dog, an irritated sneer crossed his features. That one-eyed, spiky-haired prick. Dog had been such a stuck-up asshole. He hadn't seen them since the Hokage had thrown him into Anbu and fed him to the wolves. Or more fittingly, the Jaguar. The thought of his now ex-mentor made him frown. Glancing at the panther mask for a moment longer, he clipped it to his waist as he donned his old one. At least now you don't have an old, used on your face, not judging if you're into that though. Naruto's eye twitched before snapped his eyes shut, closing himself off from the ether. Ignoring the flush running up his cheeks, he looked down at his gloved hands and squeezed his fingers shut. He could feel the worn, calloused skin beneath stretch like battered leather. His cold eyes hardened into slits of rime. Fuck him. He made it perhaps 5 feet out of the door before something occurred to him. Promptly spinning around, he marched back into the room, past what was probably a very confused specter. He walked all the way back into the middle of the room, removed his mask, and finished his tea. Orders were orders. Naruto emerged from the armory, pulling the bracers on his arms a little tighter against his skin and readjusting the belt on his waist. He felt strangely at ease, even as some odd looks were thrown his way from the regular Anbu on their way in and out of the armory. Only the older war dogs would recognize the attire of the black Anbu. His form was fully encased in a matte black bodysuit, not unlike a military wetsuit. A selection of armor pieces such bracers and shin greaves allowed him some protection. Unfortunately, he bore no official rank, so he had decided to forego the flak vest. I probably could have taken it if I wanted to. The color of his mask seemed to bear its own authority, after all. Every little advantage helped, Naruto surmised as he shifted the large Fuma shuriken on his back. His form vanished in a cascade of ash and cinder, and he reappeared in front of the door to the Hokage's office. Funnily enough, he almost felt the Anbu hidden in the shadows stiffen the moment he appeared. They were probably expecting to see the foreboding Jaguar mask. Naruto stifled a smirk as he felt the tension relax immeasurably. He couldn't help it, the old man's body flickered so damned cool. It had taken him months to convince the grumpy Anbu to teach him how to do it. Approaching the receptionist, he nodded. "The Hokage summoned for me." The poor girl jumped at the sudden voice. "Kami, please enter right away, Anbu-sama." She replied, massaging her chest where her heart was probably thumping from the scare. Naruto cocked a brow behind his mask, but nodded and entered regardless. Anbu-sama. Weird. The office was the same as he remembered it 5 years ago. Bookshelves lined the walls, stacked high with texts new and old, cheap and expensive. A fireplace in the left wall crackled gently, the flames sputtering as embers crawled across the freshly replaced wood. The back wall was still entirely made of glass, presenting a gorgeous view of the Leaf Village. Moreover, the god of shinobi was still sat behind his desk, with mounds of paperwork stacked high on far edges of the desk, likely pushed to the side in irritation. The old Kage looked up, a grandfatherly smile on his face that faltered as he took in Naruto's appearance. Out of a butcher, a finger of death. "Naruto-kun, you look formidable." The boy cocked his head to the side. "Damn, it's been a while since I heard someone say my name." He pushed the disturbing thought away and dropped to one knee with his head bowed, showing off his silky, ashen locks of spiky hair. "Hokage-sama." There was no response for a moment before the old man sighed. It was forlorn sound, damned, even. Did he do something wrong? "Stand, Naruto. Remove your mask." The boy stood and glanced uncomfortably at the 3 Anbu still hidden in the room. He was surprised he could spot them, but then again, he had studied under the greatest assassination specialist Konoha had ever seen. Again, the Anbu around him stiffened. A wave from the Hokage, however, saw them all vanish. Nodding in satisfaction, the black Anbu reached up and snapped off his mask, fastening it to his belt before meeting the eyes of his Kage. The old man's eyes seemed to grow soft for a moment before he stood, gesturing for Naruto to approach. "Good to see that old relic left your face unmarred, be a shame for the ladies." Naruto didn't quite know how to respond. This was his Kage, why was he being shown such levity? It must be a test. "As you say, Hokage-sama." The old man's face fell again. A haunted look entered his eye as he glanced out the window. Absently, Naruto followed his gaze and found himself glancing at the smiling face of the yondaime. Hiruzen meanwhile was in a state. He had made a grave mistake. He had made such a costly mistake. Had Jaguar been erroneous in his claim? What stood before him was the quintessential black Anbu. Hands folded behind his back, eyes constantly scanning for threats, dead and devoid of emotion, blood and murder constantly on the me. Forgive me Hokage-sama, but you seem troubled. His eyes snapped back to the boy. Black Anbu did not speak out of turn. I am pondering something, dear boy. The white-haired boy nodded. My apologies he began, before the old cage waved him off. It's fine, Naruto. I was pondering about you, after all. There was no reaction from the boy, but it seemed he hadn't quite mastered the ability to sedate his facial features as of yet. The question in those ice blue eyes was as clear as day. I was wondering if I made a mistake. He explained calmly. Again, the reaction was minuscule at best, but still present. Maybe there was hope. I was told that I passed all programs and operations. The Hokage waved a hand, cutting him off as he nodded sagely. Oh, I'm sure you've done more than passed. Your instructors tell me that they felt like they were molding the second coming of the White Fang, or even Black Paw Jaguar himself. The aged wizened brown eyes turned to meet the stoic Horfrest blue ones. I was referring to the theft of your childhood, Naruto. Was it a mistake to force you into this life? That is what I wonder. He explained, turning to glance out of the window. The boy did not reply for a moment. He walked a few steps closer, stopping short a respectable distance away. Am I not a Jinchuriki, Hokage-sama? My very existence is to serve Konoha as its weapon and shield. The statement was made as if it was ludicrous to think otherwise. I fail to see what other choice you had. Naruto could see the pain etched in the old man's eyes in the reflection of the window, a baffling notion. The old cage began, that sort of thinking is what starts wars, Naruto. He turned and gestured to the display in front of him. Come here, tell me what you see. Naruto complied, moving around the desk to stand beside the Hokage. He stared out over the open village, his eyes dancing across the rooftops and streets. Konohagakure no Sado. He stated. Most would say that they see their home. The old cage didn't need to see Naruto's frown to know it was there. Your home isn't here. It is down there, deep below the earth in a dark room that could be considered for all intents and purposes, a cell. He explained. Naruto said nothing, could say nothing. The old man was technically right, the only time he was out of the Black Anbu barracks was to train or conduct a mission. He couldn't name a single restaurant in Konoha or shop or popular gathering or I have indeed made a mistake, one I rather intend to correct. The cage placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and a sudden accumulation of static energy accompanied with the uncomfortable bunching of muscles beneath the combat bodysuit made him rethink his actions as he removed it. He needed to be careful. Jaguar was correct that the monster was not yet fully birthed, however, it was close. So damned close. It was for that reason he did not immediately order the boy to divulge his secrets. About where he learned to harness the white lightning, about who had been teaching him all those years ago, about everything that had baffled him about Uzumaki Naruto for all those years. Internally, the old cage shook his head. It would come with time, he told himself. He was a patient man. He could yet wait longer. Abandoning that train of conversation, he turned to face the boy. But first the Hokage's eyes fell to Naruto's waist, eyeing the old dull black mask with the number 1 emblazoned in white that the boy had been wearing. The questioning eye had Naruto inhaling softly as he bowed. Forgive me Hokage-sama, but he struggled to find the words. Speak. The command ripped through him, forcing his mouth open regardless. I feel that my training was interrupted and my promotion falsified. The Leaf Cage's brow perked in abject curiosity. Do you believe Grandmaster Jaguar incorrect in his assessment? Naruto swallowed thickly. Time to make or break. Yes, Hokage-sama. There was a long pause and then a small, satisfied smirk spread over the Hokage's lips for a split second before it vanished. He gestured to his desk, relinquish your mask. He ordered. That was it then, Naruto thought. He should have known better than to expect the Hokage to ignore blatant insubordination. Straightening solemnly, Naruto stepped forwards and reached towards his waist. The click of the tongue had him pausing. No, not that one, the other one, you stupid boy. Naruto's eyes snapped up to his cage, before with a breath of relief he could barely hide, his fingers moved away from his old mask. The panther mask was set down face up with a soft thud. The Hokage stared at him for a moment before sniffing in amusement. I, and the Grandmaster himself agree with you. Naruto stiffened. I ordered your training at an end, despite your mentor's disapproval. Why? Hiruzen shrugged. My answer would not satisfy you, not until you grow as old as I. He turned to look at Naruto. Never mind my reasoning, just know that you shall wear that mask one day, with the Jaguar's blessing. Dismissing his urge to glare at the old man, Naruto nodded. Understood, sir. Your designation is now Nix. When dismissed, see the armorer and have him forge you a new black mask, one that is blank to represent your designation. Naruto nodded. Nix as in nothing strangely fitting, I guess. Understood, sir. Taking a seat in his chair, the old cage lit up his pipe with a snap of his fingers, with a casual display of elemental manipulation. Despite this, you have still finished your conditioning and recruitment training. You may now be designated for active service, and so, you shall be. Naruto nodded. The daimyo has politely requested a meeting, and I intend to respond. You will serve as my bodyguard and personal assistant. Understood, sir. Naruto blinked. Hang on a second. Author's notes. Yo. As you have most likely already discerned, I decided to take some liberties with the chosen universe. I shall keep doing so, because imagination is wonderful like that. I would not hesitate to classify this as AU, although I'm not looking to spit on everything Kishimoto has built. To clear any confusion, not a soul knows what happened on the night the Kyuubi attacked. For all they know, Uzumaki Naruto is now the registered Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Black Anbu are not traditionally canon. In this world, they are simply an upper echelon Black Ops unit that was deployed in times of war by the order of the Nidaime. Regarded once as the Bujiman of the shinobi world, they are now defunct. Questions review response. Vindictive glory. Is the technique by Akurai? Seems oddly reminiscent of that. Not exactly. I haven't watched Bleach, although I can see where the similarities may be made. I read every review I get, so please do not hesitate to say what's on your mind. Also, for those who did me the favor of reading these boring author notes, enjoy a little extra something for your troubles below. Lessons with Jaguar, number 1. Do you understand the true nature of the mask I wear? The low, drawling tone of Jaguar 2-1 was something to behold. There was so much aged wisdom in the man's monotone voice, as contradicting as that statement was. Naruto, young and more than a little afraid, nodded. It means you're stronger than others. The harsh sound echoed around the room, and the snowy-haired child felt tears begin to well up behind his eyes from the roaring pain that flared up across the left side of his face as he was sent sprawling. Jaguar stood with his arms still raised from the backhand, watched as the child scrambled back to his feet and barely, just barely, managed to hold back his tears. He sneered. It was still not good enough, but at least the runt was getting better. A-Black Anbu did not show emotion. As if he hadn't nearly just cracked a 5-year-old's cheekbone, he lowered his hand and shook his head slowly. Not just others stronger than them all. He hissed violently. We were created for nothing but carnage. Deployed when the world was up to their necks in blood, we were the monsters that grabbed the backs of their heads and drowned them in it. He crouched down before the boy, the steel spike that had replaced one of his legs peering into the stone as he did so. War is primal, bringing out the worst in an already despicable world. This is a savage place, a realm of trickery, murder, conflict and sadness. The stinging in his cheek began to fade as Naruto nodded. He had seen into the other place, had seen the proof that legitimized Jaguar's words. But amongst the grime, there is joy, love, loyalty and so many more virtues that justifies trying to wade through the muck. The eyes of Frost glanced back up, surprised. We play the part of the demons in the dark so that the weak and the ignorant can go back to their pathetic lives. The scarred angry eyes that peered at Naruto through the narrowed slits grew darker. From this day forward, you are and will always be a monster. The eyes crinkled and something told Naruto that the cruel man was smiling. However, you were always a monster, weren't you? The boy froze. Did he know about the other place? Did he know about Ghost? Tell me, Runt. What do you know of the Bijk? Chapter 2 A Black Dawn 2. Land of Fire, Capital City, Fire Lord's Palace. Uncomfortable. That was the perfect word to describe exactly how Naruto felt right now. The notion only strengthened as he politely slipped away from a nobleman that was trying to fob his daughter off onto him, despite the fact he was at least half a decade younger than her. Apparently, walking in tow as the lone entourage of probably the most renowned of the 5 Kage was something of a statement. Many had taken him, much to Naruto's chagrin, for the old man's assistant, or God forbid, apprentice. Lone entourage, he scoffed quietly under his breath. Yeah, sure. The thought passed through his mind, even as he directed a subtle glance up towards the rafters. Striding above on one of the large wooden beams that supported the grand ceiling, a jackdaw masked Anbu trailed Naruto lazily. The slim man offered him a friendly 2-fingered wave, and Naruto restrained the urge to flip him off. A serving girl passed by, and the familiar scent of melted caramel and daffodils invaded his nostrils. Almost instinctually, Naruto cracked his knuckle at a slightly awkward angle, bringing on a sharp spike of a pain through the joint. The Jinjutsu fell, and he watched as the kindly serving girl faded away, revealing instead a weasel mask Anbu who was sliding around through the crowds with an unmatched grace. He caught her gaze for a split second, and his fingers flashed in standard Anbu code. Abnormalities. Her eyes flashed blood red from behind her mask for but a split second before they returned to normal. She didn't reply immediately, instead, her eyes fell to the leftmost pouch on Naruto's hip. The ashen-haired Anbu felt an embarrassed heat crawl up the back of his neck, however he schooled his features well. He could almost see the accusing stare behind her mask, even as her head shook in reply with the barest of movements. Coughing lightly, Naruto walked away from her and resumed stalking after the Hokage, who seemed strangely at ease flitting through the crowds. The crafty old shinobi had the uncanny ability to subvert the attention of those he deemed less important whilst somehow ensnaring the wealthy and the influential in his presence. Naruto, who was desperately trying to keep up lest someone stab the old man whilst his bodyguard got lost, it was almost maddening. There were so many people hiding behind a veneer of wealth and politeness, using it like a shield. It would set any shinobi on edge, let alone a black Anbu. Naruto lamented the fact that he didn't even have his own mask to hide behind. The old man had forbidden it. Likely at my own damned expense. The young Anbu restrained his urge to sneer at the man's insufferable antics. He was instead forced to hide behind a transformation technique, bearing northern features and darker hair to complement his paler complexion. Apparently, the old Kage had seen the environment fit to assess his non-combative abilities. Naruto knew better, this was but another of the many hijinxes the Hokage had pulled so far. From the moment they had walked out of Konoha's gates, the Sandaime had toyed with him much like a kitten does with a ball of yarn. From being sent on a wild goose chase and finding a specifically shaped leaf to stealing a noblewoman's panties, Naruto had decided that the old man was clinically insane. The two other Anbu that were his teammates as the Hokage's protection detail had of course found it within their hearts to consider it a new norm. There was a sudden tap against his shoulder and Naruto turned as he was broken from his irritated musings. The dashing smile on his falsified face faltered upon seeing the subtly tickled features of his Kage. Brow rising in slight confusion, Naruto chanced to glance in front and found the Hokage he had been tailing still chattering away. But the shadow clones. Have you accomplished your assigned directive? The tone was grandfatherly, but the amused gleam in the old shinobi's eye was wicked. The words had the snowy-haired Anbu inhaling subtly in an effort to maintain his composure. As discreetly as he could, Naruto reached into his leftmost hip pouch and produced a freshly plucked pair of panties in all their dainty pink glory. The old man's eyes lit up with a perverse glow and he gave his embarrassed subordinate a proud smile. Textbook, as always. He nodded in apparent satisfaction. Keep it close on your person at all times, I know of near mythic artifacts that couldn't even hope to rival such a divine trinket. Naruto's eyes widened as he hastily jammed the scandalous piece of fabric away as a serving girl passed by. Are you? He paused, biting down hard on his lip as the Hokage's brow rose ominously. As you say, Hokage-sama. Good, very good. Naruto ignored the old man and instead stole a quick glance through the crowd at the nobleman he had escaped from just moments ago. The merchant lord was now bantering away with someone else, oblivious as his admittedly gorgeous daughter shuffled behind him awkwardly, eyes pressed rather tightly together. Her face was flushed a beetroot red as her eyes scanned the floor, desperately searching for what sat innocently in Naruto's pocket. Embarrassed and pitying the poor girl whom had been smiling winningly at him but a minute earlier, the black Anbu quickly tore his gaze away. I think I'd rather be back having my ass handed to me by Jaguar, he mumbled under his breath. Sarutobi perked a brow at this, not a soul would share the same sentiment as you. That old fossil even gets on my nerves. He glanced sidelong at his bodyguard as they stepped from the daimyo's ballroom and further into the castle itself. Unless you enjoy his company. He didn't get frisky did he? Naruto blinked, a brow rising in a query, before his lip curled up in disgust as he finally grasped the insinuation. That's a negative, sir. He said demurely, put off by the horrendously unattractive notion. The Grandmaster's contempt for the concept of modesty was plain, however he refrained from the acts you speak of. He continued quietly, even though I understand that it was common practice in your era. The little retort slipped out despite himself and Naruto bit down on his lip with a fanged canine as he winced, waiting for the reprisal. However, the Hokage merely squinted at him before making a show of looking away pointedly and stepping a pace to the side to put some distance between them. If you say so. It was childish. It was just a childish ploy, a teasing that would not in a million years faze the enigmatic persona that was a black Anbu. Yet somehow, Naruto's brow still twitched despite this. The old man was frighteningly good at pushing his buttons. It was to be expected, having over half a century to perfect the irritating art form, however the monkey Kage's approach towards it blew Jaguar's own attempts to unsettle Naruto out of the water. It's a completely different style of approach. He reasoned. Jaguar was a nightmare, employing the use of a slow, mounting terror that toyed at the mind and sapped at the senses. It was a psychological roller coaster that never climaxed, putting the victim in a perpetual state of unease. It was something Naruto was quite familiar with. Terror, danger, and pain were old friends hiding in the corner of every room. They didn't unsettle him anymore, not when he had seen their true faces. The Hokage was just a hypocritical, lecherous old coot. An S-ranked hypocritical, lecherous old coot that is renowned across the lands as the god of shinobi. The conflicting disharmony of the thought was baffling enough by itself. It was not something he had been trained to deal with and the Hokage was pouncing on that weakness like a starved animal. Now he had two old farts trying to royally mess with him. A dead one in one world and one that he wasn't able to get back at without being perfidious in the other. Whose baby did I kick in my past life to deserve this? Idly, he registered Weasel's form stepping into stride on the other side of the Hokage, just as Jackdaw dropped down from above next to Naruto. I've never been more impressed in my life, Nix. The slim man's smooth voice was halfway between a laugh and being genuinely in awe. Naruto resigned himself to his fate as the Hokage grunted sportingly in agreement and a very familiar cold chill patted the top of his head. As if that wasn't enough, he could feel a crimson gaze boring into the side of his head even as he shook it. Shut up. Jackdaw snickered as he unclipped his weapons pouch and jingled it in front of Naruto. I'll give you my best kunai for it. Your squad leader gave you an order. The curt statement cut through the air like a knife, despite the soft voice itself. Naruto restrained the urge to kiss the weasel mask Anbu and instead silently breathed a prayer of thanks in her direction. Follow it and shut up. I hope you still like Poki. I'm going to drown you in it for this. Sulking to himself, Jackdaw put away his kunai pouch and sighed. Seeing that no one was paying his woes any mind, he sighed again, except much louder. Naruto's eye twitched. What kind of crackpot team did the Hokage put together for this? He stewed silently as they weaved through the grandiose hallways and stepped through multiple checkpoints on the way to the royal family's quarters. At some point, the Hokage dismissed the two ancillary Anbu, ordering them to remain unseen. Naruto watched them leave, barely even able to track Weasel. He quickly lost her altogether as she layered a genjutsu over her form. His mind fell to his current squad and the Hokage's bizarre decision to anoint him as the acting leader. Despite this, the two had voiced no complaints. It was expected, of course. They were Anbu. Weasel 1-4 long-ranged assault, age 15, A-ranked Nin of Anbu Platoon Alpha attached to Squadron 4. It had come as a surprise when the familiar Anbu had appeared in the Hokage's office. He hadn't seen her for 5 years. I wonder if she even recognizes me. He had read her file, as expected of a squad leader, however temporary that may be. He had not been disappointed. Her credentials were nothing short of incredible. She was a prodigy, in all senses of the word. It was expected of course, considering that the name behind the mask was somewhat notorious. Names and faces were not as sacred to the Anbu as they were to the Black Anbu, and very few could claim not to know who was behind the weasel mask. There was a curious black spot in her service record, which he had learned from Jaguar most likely indicated Black Ops movement. Black operations were typically void the usual assignment protocols and were issued directly by the Hokage. No record of the mission taking place would ever be officially submitted to the archives, let alone made public. Almost all of the Black Anbu's missions during their years of active service were considered as such. What was curious to Naruto was that the black spot in Weasel's file took place during the Uchiha Civil War. The war, if one could call it that, had begun and ended in a single night. Weasel's implications were palpable to him, especially considering her association to the clan. She must have acted as the Hokage's chess piece during that night 3 years ago. It's pretty obvious which side the old man chose, considering the other one was exterminated by its own kinsman. The thought was tremendously intriguing, however also tremendously nerve-biting. Classified information was classified for a reason, and his assumptions were becoming dangerous to make. Putting Weasel out of his mind abruptly before his inquisitive mind led him even further down the rabbit hole, Naruto instead shifted his attention to Jackdaw. Jackdaw 3-1, Supplementary Defensive Specialist, age 19, B-ranked Nin of Anbu Platoon Charlie attached to Squadron 1. The man was something of an anomaly, and the Hokage's choice in choosing him for his personal guard was an abstract one. Jackdaw's record was nothing special, comprised of mainly border patrols and skirmishes. At first glance that was. Black spots littered the individual's file like pockmarks. The cover-ups and forged alibis had been masterfully done. Naruto barely would have caught it if it weren't for Jaguar and his paranoid teachings. The man himself was a royal headache, however his secrets and abilities were anathemas that had the ashen-haired Black Anbu's interest piqued something fierce. His musings came to abrupt halt as the Hokage stopped. Naruto snapped back to focus, noticing that they had halted in the middle of a rather lavish hallway. He frowned for a moment, his gaze scanning his surroundings. Something was off, he felt like he had just stepped into a spiderweb, or his train of thought cut off brusquely as his eyes fell on the paintings on either side of the hallway. He glanced at the one on his left, which was a masterful and most likely exuberantly expensive display of Fire Country scenery. He glanced at the right and sniffed lightly in mild derision. They were duplicates. Well, that's just sloppy. Flexing his fingers, he sent a flash of chakra through his body and broke the genjutsu over his form. As an added precaution, he flared several more times and bit down in his lip with a sharp canine to break any secondary, or God forbid, tertiary layers. The endless hallway in front of him fell away with a shimmer, revealing a large bronze set of double doors. The added precautions the Black Anbu took broke through the secondary layer, revealing the formidable-looking shinobi that was stood guard outside said door. He was a tall man, draped from head to toe in flowing black and red fabric that bore the look of Eastern origin. An opaque black turban that left his features obscured covered his head and face. Naruto wagered that the turban bore the same properties of his own Anbu mask. It would be rather strange if it didn't, and the man was just walking around blind. A large club of some sort sat on the foreign shinobi's back to finish the ensemble. It was a simple-looking thing seemingly fashioned from the branch of a large tree. However, Naruto had long since learned his lesson when it came to disrespecting the chosen weapons of others. Memories of Jaguar beating him near to death with a live fish when he had struggled to perfect water walking on the open ocean came to mind. His reverie was cut off as his nostrils twitched. Inhaling gently through the nose, Naruto followed the scent of strawberries and tulips and turned his head up to gaze into the shadows of the hallway above them. It took a moment, but he was finally able to pick out the obscured form of a kunoichi perched in the shadows cast by the chandelier above. A moment passed as Naruto just stared at her before she suddenly dropped down into a soundless crouch. She stood, folding her arms in annoyance as she glared at the black Anbu that broke in both layers of her genjutsu and picked her out from hiding. Both wore white sashes across their hips, revealing themselves as members of the 12 Guardians. These were the royal family's personal shinobi bodyguards. The newcomer was attractive, to say the least. But that's the point, isn't it? This was her speciality, he assumed. To wrap the noose around the necks of those who like to think with their second head. He wondered how she dealt with her targets after they were ensnared. He saw no visible weapons, although the finger-length pieces of jewelry that ended in rather sharp claws on both forefingers could likely open up a throat or two. The Hokage stepped forwards, breaking the stare down between the black Anbu and the kunoichi. He stepped past the woman and extended a small note of sorts to the large Easterner. The kunoichi's eyes fell back to Naruto as she appraised him and turned with cat-like eyes. Naruto languidly pulled his gaze away from her, having finished his own assessment. She seemed to take it as a challenge, if the sudden, offended glint in her eye meant anything. Ever so slightly, she shifted, and the kimono she was wearing fell open the barest amount. The black Anbu's gaze flickered for but a second. I should offer her the knickers in my pocket. She seems to have misplaced hers. He pondered lazily. He blinked. Wait, what? His eyes flicked towards her again and pointedly looked away rather quickly as he feigned a cough into his fist. The female guardian's eyes gleamed in amused victory. Her satisfied smirk branded itself into Naruto's memory, along with other things, as the Hokage suddenly pulled him through the doors that had been thrown open at some point. It took all of the training Jaguar had rammed into his skull to clear his mind of distractions. They stepped through without a word, emerging into what could only be described as the personal quarters of a king or an emperor. The room was large, at least the size of one of the smaller training grounds in Konoha, and stacked with bookshelves, gaudy furniture and expensive decor. Fireplaces roared on both sides of the room, casting a flickering auburn glow across the polished wooden floors. In the middle, sat on a cushion and sipping from a saucer of what was likely tea, sat the daimyo. Fire Lord Date Masurka, the white stag of Hai no Kuni. The man was lean with reasonably toned layers of muscle, for a civilian, adorning his slight figure that could be seen through the near-sheer gown he was wearing. His facial features were decidedly aristocratic with a tapered, strong jawline, a clean-shaven face, piercing brown eyes, and stark gray-white hair that fell all the way down his hips. He looked to be somewhere in his late 40s and as wizened as the age dictated as he glanced up, a small smile on his face as he regarded the newcomers. "Here's Indono, please sit with me, I have not seen you in many moons." The Hokage approached the Fire Lord, a grandfatherly smile on his face. Indeed, alas, the world keeps moving forward while us old dogs are still stuck in the mud. He gestured to Naruto, who remained a respectful distance away, eyeing up the guardian shinobi that was sat high in the rafters, hidden. "I would like you to meet my personal bodyguard, Uzumaki Naruto." The sudden announcement had Naruto glancing at his cage in surprise. However, the sardonic glint of amusement he had been expecting in the old man's eye was absent. Instead, they were hard and grave. This was no annoying prank. This was a calculated decision made by a cage. The ashen-haired Anbu spared a second glance to the figure perched above, frowning, but eventually stepped forwards at his cage's behest, falling to a knee and bowing his head in deference as the Fire Lord stood to observe him. The flowery robes and fabricated features vanished in a blur as he dispelled his henge, revealing his ashen hair and black Anbu attire. "At ease, young one." The Anbu rose, hands immediately fastening behind his back as he bore the daimyo's scrutiny with a perfected grace. When one has endured the predatory glare of Jaguar 2-1 for half a decade, the inquisitive appraisal of a nobleman was comparably a farce. No matter just how noble said nobleman may be. The daimyo analyzed the boy from head to toe, taking in the brilliantly cold blue eyes, the silvery white hair and the toned musculature underneath the bodysuit before pursing his lips. "Scary." The man commented playfully. Naruto didn't reply as he dipped his head in acknowledgement. His features were porcelain. The daimyo grinned. "How many summers have you seen, mighty bodyguard of the Hokage?" he asked with an amused smile. Naruto ignored the jibe, as expected of him, and turned his head to meet the daimyo's eyes unrelentingly. 10. Daimyo-sama. His voice was mechanical, as crisp as it could get without the aid of the synthesizer seal system and his mask. The daimyo nodded, holding the eye contact effortlessly. Rather young to be charged with protecting the most important figure in your village, in my opinion. He stated, what do you think? He asked, as if discussing the weather. Naruto bit back the urge to shrug lackadaisically. Respectfully, I think I shall do whatever is necessary to see my task completed regardless of my age, Daimyo-sama. He replied. The Fire Lord pursed his lips before nodding sagely. He turned back to Hiruzen and perked a brow, a real soldier you have by your side here, you've trained him well. He commended before gesturing to the tea set. Tea, Hiruzen dono. Please. Naruto stepped back, content to fade away into the shadows of the room before the daimyo suddenly snapped his fingers. Have you been trained in the etiquette of tea making, young Naruto? He asked suddenly. The Anbu frowned minutely, preparing to reply when the Hokage suddenly grunted. No, he hasn't, but I am sure he is eager to learn. Indeed, come child, let me show you. Blinking owlishly, the Anbu stepped forwards. His form slinking out of the shadows as he approached and at the daimyo's behest, knelt beside the man. There were people in the lands that would pay coin in amounts that would boggle the mind for such an honor. Naruto was just apprehensive. Understandably, this was a little out of his jurisdiction. He began the process, his fingers deft as he carefully brewed the tea leaves. Every now and then the daimyo would break from his conversation with the Hokage to lean over and whisper some sort of advice or correction in etiquette or otherwise, but he managed rather well overall. Eventually, he poured 2 measures into the saucers provided and stepped back, his task finished. Absently, he realized his brow was just the faintest bit damp with sweat. Why was that so intimidating? He had been making tea for God's sake. Both the daimyo and the Hokage took a leisurely sample, unaware of his inner vamping. The Hokage grumbled and the daimyo smiled genuinely. Not sweet enough. Perfect. The 2 men glanced at each other before the daimyo shook his head in exasperation. Are you not supposed to watch your figure as a shinobi? He chided before turning to Naruto. Do not mind him. An exemplary effort, Naruto-kun. The Ashen-haired Anbu bowed, my deepest gratitude, Daimyo-sama. Filing away the attached suffix to his name with some curiosity. I think that will be all, Naruto-kun. The daimyo gestured to the door that led to the blossom garden outside. Perhaps you could go for a walk outside. Be sure to pay a visit to the stone rivers, I raked them myself this morning. Naruto nodded, acknowledging the dismissal, and after sharing a split-second glance with his Hokage who approved with a small nod, he promptly exited the way he had been directed. The Hokage watched the boy leave, his gaze growing solemn as the door closed shut behind him. He turned an eye back to Masurka, what do you think? The daimyo hummed as he sipped at his tea, milling the question around for a moment. I quite like the boy. He smiled genially for a moment, as if he was reminiscing, before shaking his head and becoming thoughtful once more. He possesses that quiet sort of strength most tend to misjudge or overlook, but yes, he is very detached. He cocked a brow at the cage. I thought you were against creating such weapons, as you shinobi say. He asked, his tone curious. Hiruzen frowned, the lines in his aged face drawing tighter. I did not have much of a choice, he is quite high profile, it's just that the world doesn't know it yet. Son of the Yellow Flash. Yes, I would expect such a title to draw attention when it comes to light. Hiruzen let out a slow breath, blinking away the memories of a pair of giant eyes, flashing scarlet and filled with rage, hatred and bloodlust. Amongst other things. He murmured softly. Ignoring the daimyo's inquisitive look, he shook his head. Why have you called for me, Masurka dono? This was quite sudden. The levity seemed to leach from the daimyo's shoulders as he placed his cup down and stood with a sigh. My judgment has rather softened, as of late. Perhaps my age is making me lax, but the statement stands nevertheless. The Fire Lord turned. Slow, soft strides led him to a glass cabinet, within which sat a glorious suit of decorated, although battle-scarred white armor. The great horned helm set with the face of a demonic deer or stag leered back at the daimyo. Tell me, Hiruzen. If we must come to blows with the land of wind, how would Konoha fare? The Hokage's eyes widened as he stood slowly. That is a rather loaded question, Masurka dono. I understand, but humor me if you would, old friend. The daimyo's face was like iron, his brown eyes that had been full of mirth and sparking with curiosity just moments before had dimmed into a steeled point. The Hokage frowned, he had seen that look before. Nothing conciliatory ever came from such a look. Regardless, he put his wizened mind to use. Their hidden village is untouchable. He stated finally, and at Masurka's surprised glance, he shrugged indifferently. From an attrition-based standpoint, assaulting Sunagakur would be tantamount to suicide. Our forces would eventually win, yes, but the attrition we would suffer would negate any sort of triumph. It is why, even though they are the weakest village in all military, political, and economical standings, they are still a powerhouse. It is simply not worth the cost, and even if it was, we would be weak enough for any of the other villages to crush us in the aftermath. He explained. The daimyo nodded, as if he had spent many a night pondering the same exact thing. And of their daimyo? How would we fare against his standing army? He asked, running a hand over the enameled beige-weld nadachi that was placed next to the suit of armor. The blade was old, the metal worn, and the intricate leather handle stained dark with years of blood and sweat. Even still, the edge was still keen enough to split hairs. He knew because he cleaned and polished it every morning. The old Kage grunted softly. The relations between the Wind Daimyo and his hidden village is not one of amicable concord. They will not reinforce each other, not without great reason. Hiruzen shrugged. That said, the war would be bloody and savage, but quick. Hiruzen stated callously. I know Kuni will come out on top with only minimal to moderate casualties. The fire court is simply too well funded and connected to lose. The Circa nodded again, before sighing. I ask this, old friend, because I possess in my hand something that would likely sour the tongues of both the Kazukiage and the Wind Daimyo. Furthermore, I do not wish to wash my hands of it for both moral and strategic reasons. He turned to Hiruzen, his eyes worn. You have heard the rumors of the Wind Lord, yes? The monstrous tyrant of a ruler, or so they say. Many a noble had fled from his court plus. The Hokage nodded grimly. I have heard, yes. But they are only rumors. The doors to the daimyo's quarters opened at that moment, admitting two women, one far younger than the other. Rumors they are not, Hokage-sama. I assure you. The female voice was delicate and lilted with a rolling accent that was pleasant to the ears. Hiruzen frowned at Misurka, but the man was no longer paying attention and was instead staring deep into the eyes of the demonic buck that adorned his helm. The Hokage turned and inhaled deeply at the sight that greeted him, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He was gazing upon a young woman, barely into her early teens. Flowing, gorgeous silks that flaunted her assets wrapped around her form. Her skin was the soft color of honey, and the lower half of her face was covered by a transparent silk keffiyeh, or veil, as per the tradition of Kase no Kuni's female nobility. On her head, rested a circlet embossed with emeralds and diamonds. The Hokage had never met her, but it was a shinobi's business to know things. This was undoubtedly Sanada Aiko, daughter to the Wind Daimyo of Kase no Kuni. Hiruzen shifted his gaze to the side and saw none other than a dead woman standing beside the princess protectively. Her name had long since been scratched from the bingo books as an A-ranked Kunoichi of Suna. The Kura of the Scorch release. The onset of a headache began to spring to life in the Hokage's skull as he pinched the bridge of his nose. Oh, for goodness sake, Naruto was bored. He had been standing outside for what felt an hour, but in reality had only been roughly half the time. He hadn't moved 5 paces from the doors to the garden, content to simply wait the powerful old men out. It was strange how power worked, especially considering how different it was displayed in regards to the 2 leaders in the room behind him. One could level a city in a day by invoking the ungodly wrath of the elements. The other could simply raise it again before the morning came. Naruto snorted softly in mild amusement. That might be a bit of an exaggeration. He spent a moment trying to refine the quote before eventually disregarding it entirely. Philosophy wasn't exactly his forte. Another 30 minutes of idling passed before he eventually came to the conclusion that they weren't going to be done anytime soon. Sighing, the Anbu took off, stepping over the masterfully made bridge that passed over a gurgling creek that one could have just walked over. He shook his head at the frivolous eccentricities of nobility. Why does that specific plank of wood have to be inlaid with gold? It doesn't even look good. Putting the odd choices of decor behind him, Naruto reached up, adjusting the Fuma shuriken in between his shoulders when the hairs on the back of his neck suddenly rose. He felt eyes on him, and not the eyes from that female guardian that had never stopped tailing him since the hallway. These eyes were bold and inquisitive, not even trying to hide its staring. He glanced around, and over by one of the blossom trees in the far corner of the garden, he found a girl watching him. Older than he by several years, and dressed in nightclothes that probably far outstripped his paycheck. She was resting on her side across a large bench, a book splayed out open in front of her that she had abandoned for more intriguing matters. She didn't stop staring, even when she had been caught out. Slightly perturbed, Naruto began to turn away. He caught the sight of her making a motion with a hand to someone he couldn't see before he looked away, heading down the rivers of carefully aligned stones and pebbles that the daimyo, true to his word, had arranged this morning. He was growing tired of this place. People were hard to deal with when you weren't supposed to kill them. The thought made him pause. God, I sound like Jaguar. He shivered uncomfortably. Something blurred in front of him to block his path, and Naruto reacted instinctively, his body engaging into autopilot before his brain could catch up. The Fuma shuriken came whirring from his back, the giant 3-pronged weapon spinning like a buzzsaw in his hand as his chakra flooded the expensive conductive metal. The individual that had jumped in front of him realized their mistake as they reared up two kunai that they had drawn from somewhere raised in a cross block. It may have worked against a conventional weapon, but against a whirring Fuma shuriken, the stranger found their kunai ripped from their hands as the hooked blades latched onto and flung them away like insignificant chips of wood. The female guardian from earlier instinctively reared back, giving up an arm to sacrifice to the infamously awkward but terrifying weapon bearing down on her as she readied a substitution. The menacing buzz of the Fuma came to an abrupt halt. Well, this is awkward. Naruto cleared his throat lightly as he stepped back and stowed his monstrous weapon. He struggled somewhat to meet her eyes after her showing earlier, wary of his composure slipping if he did so. Instead he just looked at her nose. My apologies. The female guardian lowered her arm, a rather scathing sneer, marring her attractive features as she regarded the boy that had been about to take her arm off at the elbow. She raised her hands and flashed through a series of signs with delicate fingers. Your lady requests your presence, Anbu-sama. Naruto frowned, civilian sigh. Apparently, someone had filleted this woman. Absently his nose twitched, riffling slightly with a strange almost sickly sweet scent that he couldn't quite place his finger on. It made him feel somewhat nauseous as he cleared his now itchy throat. Shaking the unease off, he jerked his head back in question towards where the young woman had been located. You mean her? Her fingers flashed again. The princess, yes. Naruto's brows rose slightly, she's the what now? Oh boy, at the woman's stare that lingered on the border of irritated and amused, he shook his head with a sigh and turned back around. His form faded away like ash in the wind as he utilized Jaguar's infamous body flicker variant. He reappeared 10 feet from the noblewoman, his form seemingly assembling from cinders. The princess looked up, inhaling a little sharply in surprise before quickly regaining her composure. She sat up, leaning on one hand as Naruto folded his own hands behind his back. His frozen blue gaze locked onto her own hazel eyes. He looked the very picture of a perfect shinobi. She seemed to appraise him for a moment before the corner of her lip quirked up. I amuse her, apparently. Oh goodness, aren't you adorable? She gushed, a delighted smile spreading across frankly exquisite features. Or not. Or does that still count as a form of amusement? What is your name, Shinobi-san? Her voice suddenly went soft, like spring water flowing through a creek. It almost caught the boy off guard. Nevertheless, he inclined his head. I am designated as Operative Nyx, Princess. He cleared his throat again, frowning as his tongue tingled slightly in his mouth. She perked a perfectly groomed brow. What is your real name, Shinobi-san? A faint smile played at her lips. I can already see your cute little face, after all. It cannot hurt to know your name, can it? The Anbu paused for a moment before suddenly realizing that he hadn't reapplied his transformation. Damned moron. Blinking slowly in exasperation, Naruto shrugged. I suppose it can't. The princess beamed at him, waiting patiently. After a while, she cocked her head to the side curiously. Well, yes. Naruto restrained the urge to laugh as she pouted at him. Are you going to tell me? Depends, is that an order? He rather regretted the words the moment they left his mouth as her eyes lit up in devious intrigue. Oh? She smiled innocently. Would you be forced to follow it if I said it was? Perhaps. He watched her chew on her pink lips, half smiling and half glaring at him playfully. She seemed to be quite enjoying the exchange. The notion almost made him blanch as he suddenly realized what he was doing. What the hell was wrong with him? This was the princess of the land of fire. It's an order then. His snarky boredom wiped clean with a startled revelation. Naruto bowed his head immediately. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, my lady. The dry amusement in his voice was gone, replaced instead by a level, almost fabricated monotone. The princess's smile faded at his tone. A look of regret passed over her features for but a split second. I saw that you came to the capital alongside Hokage-sama. You're correct, princess. Her previous slip-up was not repeated. If she was put off by the now robotic answers, she did well in hiding it. I saw you in the ballroom too. She smirked now, a mischievous thing that was a little too knowing for the Anbu's liking. Not a fan of high society, Naruto. His eyes began to roll before he caught himself and simply shook his head. It is not my place. She sat up a little, leaning forwards towards him. Did it grate on you? Naruto swallowed nervously at the loaded question, wetting his now incredibly dry throat. Was she doing this on purpose? The experience was far from the worst I've had. The satisfied, predatory smirk played at her lips. That's not what I asked. Yeah, she's doing it on purpose, he sighed inwardly. He could just lie. He sighed again, this time out loud. Yes. At her gesture to explain, he shrugged in defeat. The frivolous two-faced nature of your world sits uneasily with me. I much prefer the definitive killer-be-killed nuances of my world. He didn't know quite what to expect, but an amused giggle was not amongst his expectations. He had more or less just insulted the princess's entire lifestyle. I understand completely, I feel the same sometimes. She revealed, her tone sinking into a whisper as if she was disposing of some scandalous secret. In a way, she was. But is it not in a shinobi's nature to be sneaky and devious themselves? The curious question threw Naruto for a moment before his brows furrowed slightly. It is. He admitted. I suppose my feelings come across as somewhat hypocritical now. She smiled easily at him, scooting a little closer along the bench. At first glance, perhaps. At Naruto's unvoiced question, she mimicked his shrug from earlier. How she made it look inherently elegant, he hadn't a clue. Whilst the principles are the same, the motives and the forms are completely different. It must feel quite strange to you, being so familiar and yet unfamiliar with an environment. Naruto's brow perked up in surprise despite himself, and he regarded the young depiction of royalty before him in a new light. She was definitely a cut above the fools he'd had the displeasure of witnessing earlier in the night. Not bad, princess. The black Anbu nodded courteously, but made no other response. Eventually, he shuffled his shoulders, growing restless. He felt supremely uncomfortable standing in her presence, knowing just how insignificant he was in comparison. He was just a monster. He had been born staring into the eyes of ghosts, and if he fulfilled expectations, would die creating thousands more. She was the daughter of a man who ruled an entire country, her future was a polar opposite to his. How may I serve you, princess? Whatever her reply was, it went in one ear and out the other as a fetid chill ran down his spine. The tips of the garden leaves began to frost over, and the princess subconsciously pulled her bare legs closer to her form, not immediately noticing the drop in temperature. It was a warning. His eyes darted to the side, above, below. He saw nothing, ignoring the princess completely now, he turned around slowly, his arctic gaze raking over the Fire Lord's gardens. Again, he saw nothing. Flicking his tongue lightly in annoyance, his eyes flashed as he peered into the realm of the dead. Ghost was stood before him, pointing at the sloping, grandiose roofs of the main keep. Unknown variables, no headbands, no identifying gear. Naruto followed his gaze, and immediately his back foot shifted slightly as his body innately prepared itself. A figure, swathed in blacks, greys and mottled greens, was perched on the very top of the keep and watching over the gardens. Naruto could make out the handle of a sword jutting from behind the individual's right shoulder. Naruto. His eyes flashed, returning to reality as he tilted his head to the side. I think you should call your guardian and head back inside, princess. She reeled back ever so slightly, confusion evident on her face. However, yet again she showed why she was the daughter of the infamous White Stag. Nodding after a brief moment of thought, she stood and scooped up her reading material. Izuki-san, I think there's something wrong. Naruto let out a slow sigh that morphed into a slightly irritated cough as the air caught in his scratchy throat. Compassing himself as best he could, his hands rose into the shadow clone seal. Izuki-san. Her tone had grown quiet. Naruto highly doubted that there was ever a time that a guardian shinobi did not respond immediately. His head tilted back, the words "stay behind me" on his lips when he caught the flash of steel arcing down behind the princess. His form exploded forwards in a scatter of sparks and cinders as he pushed his body flicker to its limits. He could almost feel the individual cells in his body screaming out in pain as he reappeared. Lightning energy crackling up and down his arms, the black Anbu vaulted over the princess with a single acrobatic hop. One hand reached down to snatch the kunai that had been aimed at her lower spine out of the air, while the other slipped the black mask from his belt and snapped it crisply onto his face, all before his feet touched the ground. He immediately rose up, his form gliding back around the startled princess like a wraith as he blocked the sword strike aimed at her head with his arm guards. Again, like the kunai placement, the blade had been turned to the side so it would strike with the flat instead, signifying another non-lethal attack. He pushed on the sword grinding against his arm guards roughly, shoving the aggressor back before deft fingers slipped a shuriken from his pouch and flicked it towards the assassin in a two-fingered throw. The swordsman deflected it cleanly, swiping it from the air with a false-edge parry. Unfortunately, he didn't notice the faint trail of lightning chakra that lagged along behind the trajectory of the spinning piece of metal. The assassin yelped in shock, literally, as the small burst of electricity in the shuriken traveled down the length of his sword and into his hands. The dense cluster of nerves in the fingers spasmed and the man's guard was forced into a lapse for but a moment. In that moment, a kunai thudded into his skull. Naruto didn't waste a moment as the princess screamed, both at the gruesome display and to alert anyone nearby. The Anbu didn't know if the latter was on purpose, but he was eternally grateful for it regardless as he dropped a smoke tag on the ground below his feet and detonated. Immediately, a cloud of smoke spread in a 30-foot radius around them both, shrouding them in an inky blackness. The black Anbu crouched down, idly registering the filters in his mask, activating as it sifted away the smoke in the air for him. The princess behind him didn't possess such a luxury as the pervasive substance entered her lungs, resulting in gulping coughs. There's no way Jackdaw or Weasel could miss this, they must be occupied elsewhere. He ignored the princess clutching at him desperately, taking the moment of clarity to instead shift his sight back into the ethereal realm. How many more? He asked the darkness around him quietly. 2. maybe probably," came the ghostly answer. He registered the information with an annoyed frown just as the smokescreen was blown away with a wave of air, revealing both Naruto and the princess once again. The figure was stood before him, looming over the corpse of her fallen comrade that was now burned to a crisp. Naruto narrowed his eyes at that. They needed at least a body for identification. If they were burning their fallen, then he needed to take one alive. He sucked in a deep breath before quickly taking another one. Was the air thinning? Or was his breathing labored ever so slightly for some reason? Naruto was forced to abandon the thought as he suddenly ducked, slipping underneath an ninjato that cleaved apart the air above his head. His hands sifted together before he spread them out, drawing out the tendrils of electricity like glue before clapping them back together. Lightning release. Storm Giant's thunderclap. A brutal cascade of force and lightning ripped through the air, heading for the oncoming Kunoichi, who had thought to utilize her companion's attack as a distraction. Naruto swore that he heard her heart skip a beat in surprise as she jumped, arsing over the technique in a somersault. She didn't escape untouched, evident as she landed a few feet before him and stumbled, her smoking left ankle buckling slightly before she lunged forwards with her own blade. Naruto was already backpedaling, evading the second strike from the first attacker, while pushing the princess backwards with a hand as he forced the female aggressor to overextend. Gritting his teeth, the boy shoved the princess even further away from him as he whipped the Fuma shuriken from his back, the blades rapidly beginning to whir up as he used it to fend off the first assailant, who he could now see was a lean male individual. He caught sight of the female jumping back and bringing her hands together, her fingers beginning to blur through seals. Cursing under his breath, the ashen-haired shinobi lashed out with a spinning double kick to the male's chest, shoving him back more than hurting him, before moving to engage the fire user, before she finished whatever it was she was doing. He got perhaps halfway to her, before a rather ominous shadow fell above her form. Naruto paused as the kunoichi glanced up and promptly dove forwards out of the way with a startled scream as a hunk of wood almost larger than her own body came slamming down onto the earth, sending clouds of dust reeling up and shaking the ground minutely. The Black Anbu watched as the guardian, the one shrouded in black fabric from head to toe, joined the fray with a vigor. He stamped into the frenzy like a wild bull, wielding his giant club in a strange mix between brute strength and fluid dexterity. There was a momentary stutter in the combat as both attackers glanced at the guardian in what looked to be surprise. "What are you doing?" the Kaiten user began before she was cut off by a whipping frenzy of flowing strikes from the large foreigner. "Protect the princess, little soldier," came the guardian's thickly accented order as he glanced at Naruto. Another heavy slam of his club left it stuck in the ground and the guardian paid it no heed as he left it there and engaged in a furious bout of taijutsu with the rapidly panicking kunoichi. "I will handle this one." He finished the statement as he suddenly whirled around mid-fight, a long sliver of black cloth flying from his wrapped-up hand to wrap around the handle of his club. The fabric seemed to come to life, animating itself as it yanked the club from the ground and reeled it back to its master's hand. Naruto couldn't watch any further as he leaned back almost a complete 90 degrees to avoid a slash that would have bisected him from thorax down. He launched back up and scattered a handful of shuriken towards his opponent, along with a much larger Fuma shuriken, before leaping on top of the stone bench that the princess had once been sat upon. His opponent let out a startled cry as his sword was nearly flung from his hands as he deflected the giant spinning wheel of death away, allowing the shuriken to bite painfully into his torso. Naruto grinned behind his mask as his hands flashed together into the dragon seal and electricity began to form in between his hands. "Man, I love that stupid thing." The energy continued charging in his hands as he evaded along the bench, stepping and dancing across the surface of the stone as he expertly dodged the sword that was furiously trying to hack him to pieces. The assailant, growing tired of the game, suddenly swung his sword in a large arc, wind chakra ripping through the air as his other hand formed a single-handed seal. Wind release. Gale cutter. As his sword twirled in his grip, dozens of near-invisible little slivers of air burst from the edge, all hurtling towards Naruto who suddenly flickered away to the princess's side. The poor girl was curled up in a ball as far back towards the edge of the gardens as she could get, watching the combat with wide eyes. The blades of wind all turned on a dime to follow him. One hand still rippling with electrical energy, Naruto broke the dragon seal to grab the princess roughly by the arm and hurl her fully into the wind technique, watching uncaringly as she screamed in fear and shock and then again in pain as the tiny ripples of wind slashed apart her body into a mutilated mess of meat and bone. The ghastly screams forced the combat to a grinding halt as both assassins and the one guardian all froze in abject shock. Capitalizing on the lull, Naruto suddenly pivoted to turn side face and reared back, his back foot sliding in the dirt as he stabilized himself as if to throw something. The hand that was still crackling with the pure white electricity tightened, clenching down as a spear of lightning formed in his grip. The Anbu then took a step forwards and hurled the javelin of electrical energy at the airborne, mangled corpse of the princess. The lightning spear left his fingers with a sizzling crack, hurtling through the air to shear through the still airborne princess's stomach. It seared its way through her body before boring out through her back and losing all coherent form. The energy didn't dissipate however, and a loose wave of electricity surged forwards and slammed into the bewildered assassin that was stood behind her. Naruto straightened up as the body of the Fire Lord's daughter popped, dispersing with a plume of smoke. The assassin behind wasn't quite as lucky as he spasmed violently, his fingers and limbs curling uncontrollably before finally crumpling to the floor in a smoking heap, unconscious. The guardian shinobi recovered the fastest, shooting out a hand that let slip a flurry of black cloth that quickly coiled around the female assassin, tangling her up and restraining her form. Her sword fell with a clatter to the ground as the large figure strode up to the bound woman and, to Naruto's surprise, twisted her head around with a sharp snap. Spitting distastefully, the large man scanned the place thoroughly before moving towards Naruto. His foot rose as he passed the unconscious, smoking form of the Naruto's latest work, and the Anbu raised a hand in a futile effort. "Wait, squelch." Naruto recoiled slightly as the incapacitated assassin's head exploded from the brutal curb stomp, the itcher and chunk splattering the gorgeous green grass, a horrible shade of pink and red. The boy barely had a moment to take the sight in before the large guardian rounded on him. His club, which was still being hefted by the single strand of black cloth, hovered menacingly behind him. "The princess, little warrior, where is she?" Pushing away his distaste, Naruto nodded towards the castle, about to answer before a wash of feedback hit his brain. Blinking, he shook his head and pointed in the vague direction of the capital city. "My clone swapped places with her the moment my smoke went off and took her into the restaurant district of city. The castle seemed compromised." He replied quickly. The club lowered, fastening itself to the guardian's back once more. "It is." He replied flatly. "A good decision, I must go to her now." He commended. The guardian turned, about to leave before his head turned to regard the boy. "You should attend to your Hokage, little warrior. There is conflict in the Fire Lord's Cham." He paused, watching as the black Anbu simply vanished in a cascade of ash and cinder. Naruto was already gone. Moments previously, the elderly and now completely irritated Hokage refrained a sigh as he shook his head for the 5th time. "I cannot grant such a request." Berserker clicked his teeth. "Hiruzen, old friend, I cannot house the prince. And you think my own neck more resistant to the guillotine's blade than yours? If you will not shelter these two, then what makes you think I will?" The Fire Lord frowned, the expression dangerous on his face. "You mistake me, Hiruzen. I would shelter them if I could. Konoha is the hidden village of Hai no Kuni, hidden, Hiruzen. This is a blasted castle that houses and entertains hundreds of nobles both foreign and not that would happily expose them for some meager profit." His tone was level and calm, as it always was, but his disposition was betrayed by the noise his teacup made as he set it down with just a tad too much force. "Why will you not aid me, old friend?" The elderly Cage suppressed another sigh. "I've been playing this game for many a year and you are nearly half a century old. Your attempt at puppy dog eyes reminds me of a crippled bear with a lazy eye, Masurka." The Fire Lord leaned back, looking away as petulantly as he could without demeaning himself. "If I may," the Exuna Kunoichi, Bakura, managed before she was suitably silenced by the Hokage's glare. As elderly as he was, the man was not renowned as the god of shinobi for no reason. Wrinkling his nose in distaste, the Cage shrugged. "What are you hoping to gain from this, Masurka? The death of the Wind Lord and his heirs, so that you may reveal the princess and snag an alliance? A bargaining chip? The semblance of my humanity." The Fire Lord interrupted, his tone deathly still. The Hokage frowned, but ceased his tirade. "I do not understand." Berserker chuckled, though it was without mirth. "Is that true? How many terrible things have we done with our power in the pursuit of the greater good, Hiruzen? Things we convinced ourselves were necessary, needed to be done, things that had no other outcome?" He asked quietly. He pointed to the armor in the display case. "You see how clean that armor is? How polished it may be?" The Fire Lord laughed. "It's filthy, layered with rot. Gaze into the threads and you will see rivers of blood, stare into the polished metal, and you will see the souls of thousands staring back in the reflection." He stood at this moment. "I may not have swung the sword that killed those I take responsibility for, but I did give the order, and gave it I did countless times." The Hokage said nothing to refute this. He too knew that uttering the word was equal to swinging the blade yourself. "You lie to me when you say you do not understand, old friend. Reconciliation and regret is what separates men like us from villains. I will not let them." He gestured to the two women, both watching on uncomfortably, "crawl back to their inevitable suffering, because it is within my power to do so, and it is within yours too, no matter how much threat it may place on the both of us." The Hokage didn't reply at first, he simply sat nursing his tea and mulling the speech over. It was a good speech. If he had been a civilian. Shinobi did not operate on feelings, nor did they weigh their morals against reason. Pale, ice-blue eyes flashed in Hiruzen's mind, and he was reminded of his hypocrisy regarding that sentiment. If only that notion held true for him, perhaps Jaguar was indeed correct. Perhaps he had grown weak. He was offered no more time to ponder the thought as a dull bang sounded out from the gardens. The fatigue in his face vanished, the lines tightened, the muscles coiled, and the chakra flared. A seasoned veteran of war in his own right, Masurka stiffened in response as Bakura shot to her feet. Two blurs shot to land protectively beside the Hokage as Weasel and Jackdaw responded immediately. A rather impressive sales pitch, Masurka don't know, but it seems we must cut this discussion a little short. With that, the Hokage blurred through a series of seals, old fingers moving fast enough to warp the air. The catatonic pressure of his chakra exerting itself on the room filtered through the air, almost forcing the Wind Princess to her knees, before the elderly Kage suddenly reared his head upwards and spat a dragon-sized belch of flame into the rafters above. Almost immediately, the flame flowing from his mouth morphed into pure air as it pushed the raging fire up into a swirling inferno as the god of shinobi let loose with the seemingly unearthly combination techniques he was famous for. The individuals who had just breached through the roof descended in time to catch the monstrous technique head-on. Charred corpses dropped from the ceiling, smoking and steaming, but the Hokage paid them no mind as he stepped back and sunk into a protective stance in front of the princess. Slipping down from the ceiling, a guardian shinobi dropped like a cat in front of the Hokage. However, the ensemble faded as the henge was dispelled, revealing a slim figure garbed in simple grey robes. The blood-stained white guardian sash was torn off and thrown roughly to the floor, its usefulness now negated. Two blurs shot to the Fire Lord's side as the nobleman drew the worn Nadachi from its scabbard by his armor stand, his once genial, noble face now narrowed into a thunderous scowl. They landed in a crouch protectively around him, drawing their respective weapons. Hiruzen recognized the flowing black and red fabrics of the club-wielding guardian from before and vaguely recognized the dual tanto-wielding Kunoichi beside him from the bingo books. These were real guardians, apparently. Immediately, the duo launched into motion, deflecting kunai, shuriken and jutsu as the room exploded into action. Sizzles and screams rang out from behind the Hokage as the infamous scorch release went to work. The Sandaime ignored it and instead popped the old bones in his shoulders loose as a myriad of nondescript enemies landed all around him. "Where are the rest of your guard?" The old Kage shouted, doffing his billowing cage robes and revealing the dark leather, plate, and mesh bodysuit he wore beneath. The Fire Lord grunted, deflecting a stray shuriken with a quick partial draw of his Nadachi. His movements were somewhat rusty, although still effective. The blade clicked back into its sheath as Masurka shrugged. "If they aren't here, then they are either defending my family or dead," he called out calmly. Stepping in front of his guardian donned in cloth, he nodded to the gardens. "Becky-san, see that my daughter and the Hokage's young soldier is safe, please." The club-wielding Easterner nodded and disappeared in a swirl of fabric, leaving the Fire Lord and his single guardian stranded on one side of the room. Locking eyes with the Hokage, the Fire Lord smiled grimly. "I hope your skills are polished, old friend." The Hokage snorted softly and his eyes changed. Gone was the kind visage and the glassy expression in his eyes. His body posture seemed to almost inflate as the slumbering nightmare within the old man awoke. Its old and graying blood-stained muzzle riffling at the scent of fresh meat. The air rippled and quaked as a horrible, pressurized flood of killing intent began to saturate the room. The grandfatherly Hokage was gone, and the god of shinobi had arrived in his stead. A freezing cold chill entered the room, accompanied by the crackling of static energy as a smaller figure, clad in a military bodysuit and bearing a foreboding black mask dropped into the midst of the fray, hovering like wraith around the Hokage and completing the Anbu trifecta. The figure in the gray seemed to lose quickly steam, re-evaluating the situation. However, the words for retreat never made it out of his mouth. "Are you injured, Hokage-sama?" Naruto received a rather bored look in response. Reddening slightly, he nodded. It was a requirement to make sure, but in all honesty, that entire sequence had been quite the farce. The enemy had been incredibly disorganized and underwhelming in their strength. The only anomaly of note had been the grey-garbed shinobi that had taken the disguise of one of the guardians. Finding the man's corpse splayed out on the ground, his grey robe singed to a smoldering crisp, Naruto conceded a minuscule nod. He had been skilled enough to take out a guardian at some point and replace them, and he had been surprisingly quick on his feet. It was unfortunate for him that Weasel's genjutsu was far quicker. The poor man had been running from the Hokage, only to run headfirst into the Hokage. Against 3 Anbu, a Kage, and 1 guardian that quickly turned into half a dozen as the others made to protect their lord well, the outcome had been sealed in stone. There was the shuffling of feet, and Naruto looked up to find the daimyo approaching him quickly, flanked by 3 guardians that shadowed him expertly. He saw the daimyo jerk his head towards the gardens, and 2 of them vanished in blurs of movement. "Nah," he began, before his eyes fell on the blank black mask. "Anbu-san," he amended, "did you see my daughter in the gardens?" Naruto's respect for the man climbed higher, and he nodded as he bowed. Yes, Daimyo-sama, I had clones escort her away from the conflict when she and I were ambushed, the guardian with the club, and I finished off the opposition before he left to retrieve her. He glanced up, he made contact with and recovered Her Highness just moments after the battle here ended. The relief on the daimyo's face was immediate and his shoulders slumped as he smiled at the young Anbu. Heavens, he massaged his heart wearily. You are a credit to your cage and village, little protector. Naruto only inclined his head respectfully before moving to stand by his Hokage's side. Jaguar immediately began ribbing him with his elbow. See. They are a symbol of good luck. His finger jabbed at Naruto's pouch. The Hokage really knows what he's talking about, huh? Stop being such a weirdo. The black Anbu half whispered, half hissed at the eccentric shinobi. You're the one with some poor girl's panties in his pock, ouch. The man was abruptly silenced as Naruto studiously kicked him in the shin. The commotion drew the attention of the Hokage, who offered them both withering glare, not unlike a teacher scolding a couple of rowdy students. Both Anbu straightened immediately, bowing their heads in apology. Naruto swore he heard the smallest of sighs slip from Weasel's lips. Jaguar leaned over, his eyes stuck on the Hokage's back, just in case the old man turned around suddenly. You almost got us in trouble. Shut up. No, you should wait. Is that an order? Ignoring the lunatic with a faintly twitching eye, Naruto instead shifted his attention to the other occupants within the large room. The daimyo had begun snapping out orders, summoning guards to flood the room and sending guardians off to double-check on his family and guests. The formidable-looking Kunoichi that was neither guardian nor leaf stood protectively over a rather striking tan-skinned girl that looked a few years older than himself. Ash that had once been living men and women littered the ground by their feet. The Kunoichi's work, Naruto guessed. What are they doing here? He whined. Smack. Hissing from the sharp slap to the back of his head, he glanced up to his cage who was eyeing him with an irritated look. Pay attention, you buffoon, I don't find enjoyment in repeating myself. The boy flushed as Jaguar snickered at him and Weasel looked away pointedly. Several eyes turned to him, including the daimyo's as he finally finished speaking to his subordinates. Oops, apologies, Hokage-sama. The old cage merely sighed as he gestured to one of the deceased attackers. I said. What do you make of this? The Fire Lord approached, his eyes on Naruto as he beckoned the two strange women over. All around them, palace guards and samurai began to secure the room zealously. He waited for a moment, not wanting to interrupt the daimyo. Jaguar nudged him again, and Naruto abruptly realized that the man was waiting for his answer. Starting slightly, he bumbled over his reply. This was an attack on the daimyo's palace. Both the daimyo and the strange Kunoichi raised a brow as Saratobi's eyes narrowed dangerously. Both his teammates just looked at him. Gulping, the rookie Anbu gestured to the gardens as he hurriedly extrapolated. The assault was two-pronged, a smaller force seeking to non-lethally neutralize the princess, while a diversion force attempted to keep the cage and the majority of the guardians preoccupied. The faces around him twisted into thought as his Hokage grunted. Non-lethal, you say? All attacks against the princess lacked any lethal elements. It seemed that capture was a priority. The daimyo's brown eyes hardened slightly as he regarded the young, ashen-haired shinobi. They must not have been counting on you being present. Naruto nodded before a thought suddenly struck him. Glancing at the daimyo, he bowed his head apologetically. Daimyo-sama, one of your guardians is either incapacitated or dead in the gardens. She did not answer when the princess called for her. The Fire Lord seemed to grow solemn for a moment. Her death shall be mourned. Whatever he was saying, it was cut off as a figure suddenly flickered to his side, the white sash signifying him as a guardian. My lord, Kazuki-sen is nowhere to be seen and… The daimyo interrupted the man with a raised hand as he glanced at Naruto. Yes, the Anbu said that she may have been killed, search the area for her body. He was cut off again as the guardian shook his head vehemently. My lord. The palace guards in the gardens have been found murdered and discarded out of sight long before the attack. The worm of unease wiggled into Naruto's mind. Suffocated to death, their throats were found swollen and congested. The unease magnified as he remembered the awful, albeit strangely intoxicating scent that had permeated the garden after his encounter with the female guardian. His throat had felt somewhat scratchy afterwards, hadn't it? It still felt a little raw, now that he thought about it. Traces of illusory chakra and lethal fumes hang in the air, genjutsu and poison, daimyo-sama. The hackles rose fully as Naruto's head pieced together the red strings. In jutsu his mind wound back to when he had thrown off the pretty guardian's illusions. Poison the guardian's scent, the irritation in his throat, it was too perfect. Unbidden, Jaguar's words flashed through his head from the last conversation they'd had together. At ease, recruit. Your toxicity resistance would make poisoning you a hassle I would rather not deal with. The memory ran through Naruto's head, and not a moment later did he suddenly recoil as a wave of nausea struck him. His hand rose to clasp his aching head as he stumbled back slightly. A sudden onset of memories, ending with his skull being smashed into mince by a giant club, had him understandably disoriented. A firm hand fell on his shoulder as the now grim-faced Hokage held him steady, his eyes tired as he seemed to grasp the situation almost immediately. Naruto's eyes widened behind his mask as the memories from his dispelled clones assaulted him. A sinking feeling rattled through his stomach as he dragged his gaze up from the floor to meet the Fire Lord's confused eyes. "Daimyo-sama, you've been betrayed." Elsewhere, the groaning sound of large wheels rotating on wooden axles, followed by the clopping of hooves and the rumbling of a carriage filled the air. Red, near-orange eyes glanced about the inside of the carriage lazily. The owner of said eyes clicked his tongue loudly as he kicked up his booted feet, letting them rest on the rather expensive-looking polished wooden table. A small grin spread over cavalier tanned features as he felt the nobleman on the other end of it tighten slightly in response. He began shaking his foot, letting the little bells that hung from his waist and around his ankles jingle merrily in doing so. The happy little sounds continued their songs for about 10 seconds before, "Shinobi-san, could you please kindly refrain?" There was no response, aside from the jangling of bells, and as the incensed figure opened his mouth to speak again, the noises suddenly stopped. Grin in full throttle, he leaned back in his chair and rested his hands behind his head, staring down at the other man all the while with dangerous eyes. "Well, since you ask so nicely." He sneered, his tone a strange mixture of condescending garishness and brash charm. The noble scowled, attempting to speak once more before the other figure suddenly drew his weapon and let it rest on the table with a soft thunk. It was a ghastly-looking thing, a long length of chain attached to what would belong on the head of a flanged mace. The dull steel was stained a dark brown in places, evidence of its gruesome use. "I'll remind you though, Gramps. I ain't a ninja." The eyes of flame and brimstone leveled a deadlock stare at the nobleman. A moment passed, and the two samurai standing protectively behind the nobleman tensed uncomfortably, their grips on their sheathed blades tightening. The carriage was very large, but it was still a horse-drawn carriage, their swords would be at a severe disadvantage in the enclosed space. "Of course, my apologies." Letting their grips slacken, the two warriors let out the sodden breath they had been holding in. Another long, uncomfortable moment passed. "Flying the Fire Daimyo's flag ain't a bad play, but we would have been better off on foot." A disdainful sniff echoed through the interior in response. "And leave myself flapping in the wind whilst you and the two guardians disappear with the princess? I do not think so." He shook his head vehemently. "Besides, no one will come looking." As that large savage outside said, the girl was simply handed to him and he himself had dispatched of the clones or duplicates, or whatever they were. For all the daimyo knows, his two loyal guardians were killed and the princess was taken by bannerless shinobi. "I coulda just went in there and stole the little whore myself, you know." He drawled lazily, his eyes drifting to the bound and gagged figure beside the nobleman. He watched as the older man's hand ran down her pale, milky thigh that was revealed by the flowing nightgown she had been captured in. Her terrified shivering seemed to only embolden her captor. The firelight in the nearby candles suddenly flickered, displaying more of the nobleman at the far end of the table. The flames revealed a diplomat or aristocrat of some sort it seemed, his robes matching that of those worn by members of the fire court. The man simply shook his head in response to the fiery-eyed individual's statement as his hand ceased its roaming, for now. "I did not expect the Wind Daimyo to send you when I made to him my proposal." "You are somewhat." The nobleman paused as the other man growled softly in warning. "Ah, notorious. Your presence would have surely implicated the land of wind." A dissatisfied scoff rang out through the air. "Besides, we only just received word of the Hokage's sudden arrival." The red-eyed figure snorted softly before spitting on the polished floor. "I could take the old man." The brow rose in response, along with his personal guard and the 12 guardian shinobi. The noble pressed, his tone admonishing. The red-eyed figure merely shrugged. "Don't you mean 10 guardian shinobi?" The chuckle met his query. "I did indeed, my mistake." His eyes drifted off to the side, locking onto the rather beautiful woman who occupied the right side of the table. She sat regally, sipping leisurely at her tea as she listened to the conversation. If she felt the princess's betrayed gaze glaring desperately at her from beside the fire court official, she didn't deign to acknowledge it. She did however look up as a bloody pair of eyes began to strip her down with its maddening leer. The lounging young man eyed her thoughtfully before an infuriating smirk split his features and he let out a low whistle of mock admiration. "Phew, a true kunoichi ain't ya? Must be tough work going around stabbing people in the back for some pocket change, eh?" His brows narrowed dangerously in response. The smirk widened. "No wonder someone butchered your pretty little face. That tongue of yours probably got you in and out of all sorts of trouble before you lost it, am I right?" The silence around the table was deafening, broken only by the sound of metal on ceramic as the oriental jewelry that adorned the former guardian's fingers tapped against the saucer. "They're probably gonna put a bounty on your head for this, a big one." The tinkling of bells started again as he began to twiddle his booted feet once more. "Between you and me, I'll probably swing by to collect your thoroughly used ass from the Wind Daimyo's bedchamers when they do." He shot her a wink. "When he's grown bored of you, of course." Almost immediately the carriage began to flood with killing intent. The ringing of steel echoed through the small space as the startled samurai drew their swords, followed by the fire court nobles' panicked pleas for peace. A foul-smelling thick haze of smoke began to fill the carriage as the tapping on the tea saucer began to grow louder and louder, making the non-shinobi wince in pain as the volume just kept climbing. Laughing to himself as the room took to chaos, the red-eyed figure grabbed hold of his flail and withdrew his feet from the table. The carriage came to a halt. It was abrupt, enough to send the pot of tea hurtling onto the floor and scatter the various ceramic cups on the table. There was no other sound, aside from the panicked shuffling of the two samurai guards and the quiet whimpering of the daimyo's daughter. The smoke began to fade away as the traitorous guardian dispelled her genjutsu, and with it, the maddening tapping vanished from the ears of all present. All eyes turned to the flail-wielding individual, who rose from his seat wearily and padded to the carriage door. Something was off. There was a retinue of 30 samurai out there, along with at least a dozen shinobi, one of which being an ex-guardian. Why was it so quiet? His hand reached for the door, and all hell broke loose. Earlier, white, deathly eyes as cold as the barren wastes of the moon raked over the populace below as the Anbu that owned them watched on with a languid mien. He had been up on the palace's highest spire for perhaps the better part of 10 minutes, watching, waiting. It was all he was permitted to do. He watched as a figure down in the sprawling city leapt across rooftops, cutting a rather impressive pace as they made for the palace. It was a little too far for him to make the figure out, but it was likely one of the guardians that had been sent on the manhunt for the traitors. The Anbu felt his jaw tighten as his mind lingered on the word. There was no way he could have known, and yet, I just handed her to him, silver platter and all. His mind pulled up unwanted memories of a neck snapping grotesquely and a head being stomped into paste, and his jaw tightened even more. That explains why he went out of his way to kill them. Whatever attempt this was on the Fire Lord, it was clear that it was a ramshackle operation carried out by subpar shinobi that were ill-informed. They had not expected the arrival of the Hokage and his bodyguards and should have backed off the moment a legendary S-rank walked through the door. It was only by the bite of snakes were they successful. Two of the daimyo's own former protectors single-handedly managed to carry the operation to a triumph, and with no prisoners to interrogate, there were no loose strings with which one could use to bring them to heel. And through it all, the capital city slept. It was interesting how little the populace knew of what intrigue occurred in the palace. They were unaware of the plots, conspiracies, and now even direct assassination kidnapping attempts that befell the court. He snorted softly, attempts or successes. The castle had lost 15 posted guards and 4 guardian shinobi, 2 of which were assassinated in cold blood, and 2 of which whom had likely been the driving force behind said assassinations. The assassins had lost 20 of their own. 3 had fallen to Naruto in the gardens, and the rest in the Fire Lord's chambers. Not like it was any consolation. They were the diversions, missing nin cherry-picked from all over with no real affiliation to shoulder the blame. They were meant to tossed away like rubbish. 20 pieces of rubbish in exchange for the daughter of Hai no Kuni's daimyo. If one was to really try and crunch the numbers, the attackers did also manage to kill all the expensive koi fish in the gardens as well by dumping a guard's body into the water. 20 pieces of rubbish in exchange for the daughter of Hai no Kuni's daimyo and a bunch of fish. What are you mumbling about over here? The ashen-haired shinobi turned a wispy wide eye onto the specter that materialized beside him before shrugging. Dead fishies, he muttered distractedly. If the ghost had a face, he was sure that a raised brow would be directed his way right now. Ah, of course, a perfectly reasonable line of thinking for the current situation. You aren't at all completely insane, no. Do you find anything interesting? He interrupted before Ghost tumbled down into one of his pointless tirades. Nope. The specter replied cheerfully. You fudged it. Caveman with big stick took girl and went stumpy bye-bye. He mocked. Naruto sighed. If Ghost couldn't find the remaining assassin, then he himself had no chance. The specter's perception was sharper than his by leagues, dead or alive. Saw a little sprite wandering around though, might be worth a shot asking nicely. It took a second for the sentence to click. Sprite, as in a ghost. Yeah, as in ghost. You deaf or something? The ghost of one of the dead assassins. No, a ghost of the one of the dead fishies, the specter replied sardonically. Naruto blinked before slapping a hand to his face in irritation and fading away, his form sifting into bits of cinder. Now what oi? Wow, not even a goodbye huh? He ignored the petulant ghost, his eyes flashing wide as he flickered across the grounds of the palace in scatters of ash, searching. Finally, he found what he was looking for down by the gardens outside of Masurka's chambers, where the assailants had made their attempts on the princess. There, milling around listlessly, floating like a wisp of something unreal was a fragment of humanity. It was almost beautiful. He had seen them before, sometimes wandering Konoha streets aimlessly in the dead of night. He had always avoided them as a child. However, he could talk to Ghost, so maybe he could. The notion ran through his mind before the full realization of what he was looking hit him like a freight train. This was a sight reserved for the Shinigami, the Reaper, the god of death Uzumaki Naruto. The revelation chilled him, yet nevertheless, he pushed on. He was barely 10 feet away, watching the little mote of energy wander around the scene of its death. It was weaving in amongst the flowers of Masurka's garden lazily. "Can you hear me?" he whispered. A chill settled around him as he felt Ghost appear beside him. He stepped closer. He had seen the dead before, had seen the families frozen in time in the run-down, dilapidated ruins that dotted Konoha. He had seen remnants of ages past in his training with Jaguar during their many trips out of the village. However, they were like paintings frozen gone. Whatever this was, it was fresh. It was alive but well-knit. "Hello?" He tried again, shuffling forwards, muscles tensed for anything to go awry. It was barely a foot away now, and Naruto could almost see the strands of fate twisted into the mote of life in front of him. For but a fleeting moment, he was overcome with a frighteningly potent fit of hunger before it vanished. Startled, Naruto watched as his hand reached out of its own volition, slowly, tentative. He struggled against it, flurrying his chakra in case it was some cheap illusion. His fingers brushed against the eerily glowing orb, and it seeped into him, like water into cloth. Suddenly regaining control over his own body, Naruto recoiled, hopping backwards as a cold shock struck his arm. He stared at his hand in disbelief as an ethereal frost began to coat the tips of his gloved fingers. Ghost stepped up beside him, his featureless face locked onto Naruto's own. "What did you just do?" The specter's usual nonchalant demeanor had vanished. Its voice was deathly low. Naruto turned slowly to meet his gaze, dread settling in as the wind began to blow. The cold gales ripped through the air, seemingly centered on him and him alone. Memories began to fill his head, ones that did not belong to him in the slightest. He began, before his voice locked up in his throat. The temperature had dropped, well below freezing. Naruto spun slowly, casting his frigid white gaze across the gardens. His feet carried him by the small pond that sat stagnant by the bench the princess had been lounging on not even an hour ago. His eyes shifted down to the water's reflection, and he barely restrained a scream as he stumbled back, falling onto his rear as he scrabbled backwards in the grass. His chest heaving, Naruto scrambled back up to the water's surface, his eyes scouring his reflection. Only the foreboding blank face of black ceramic glared back at him. He jumped as a soft hand suddenly gripped at his shoulder, and a flash flood of white electricity streamed down his body like dozens of crackling hair-thin snakes as he whirled around. His racing heart began to slow, his muscles slackening as the painted face of a weasel watched him curiously. Weasel just stared at him for a moment before glancing at the pond behind him. Red eyes flashed from behind her mask, and she finally looked back at him. Is something the matter?" Thankful that his mask was obscuring his features, Naruto shook his head immediately, perhaps a little too quickly as his jostled mind began to ache slightly. "I'm fine." She stared for a second longer, most definitely disbelieving, but unsure of what to say. Eventually, she nodded. "As you say. Get a grip, idiot." Sucking in a breath, Naruto straightened up and offered her a more neutral glance. "Has any progress been made?" Weasel shook her head slowly in a negative, subconsciously rubbing her bare arms as she noted the horribly cold atmosphere in the gardens. "Negative, however the Hokage has further orders. We are to reconvene and lend our efforts to the search." "Understood." Weasel offered him another curious glance before vanishing in a small plume of smoke. Naruto let loose the breath he had been holding, idly noticing that it came out like a miniature blizzard that frosted over the inside of his mask. His mind was unsettlingly still, as if it was having trouble processing. He lurched forwards, his form shifting forwards in a body flicker as he left the gardens. Yet the image was burned in his head of what he had seen when he peered into the water's surface. He had looked into his reflection, and the man he had killed had looked back. Author's notes. Hey there. First of all, I'd love to thank everyone for their incredible responses and kind words. The traction this thing has gotten has had me quite literally floored. Questions review response. Wicked A. Is category 5 boss summon level, or is it like the great sages? Forgive me for not writing out all of your questions, for I can't quite answer them as they may be answered within the story itself at some point in time. However, for this one, I can say that category 5s would fit in the realm of boss summons. Now the reason I decided not to use the phrase boss summon is because I found it quite boorish. Not all summons have large families or empires of mini-me's like the toads do. I don't doubt that there might be a giant solitary scorpion out in the sands of Wind Country that could rival the size and power of say Gamabunta himself. With a world this large and expansive, why couldn't there be? Therefore, the nice, simple, logistical category system it is. From 1 to 5, with 5 being boss summon territory. Aliyuxikanten. Thank fucking God. I thought for sure you were about to have Hiruzen takes him out and put him into the academy. I would have been absolutely heartbroken. Yeah, not bloody likely. I've read that sort of start enough times that I would probably be applicable for capital punishment should I be guilty of adding one more to the masses. In addition, the academy just seems like a farce anyway. People graduate out of it at all fucking ages, from the age of 4 to 12, who cares, just slap a headband on them. I'm not a fan of the academy in general, to be perfectly honest. It seems far too flexible and whimsical for my tastes. Now, not to say stories are automatically bad should they start in any sort of way or contain a certain trope. I'm personally an advocate of good storytelling. Should a writer be skilled enough to pull it off, there is no point hating it just out of principle. That's just incredibly childish. That said, there are some things that are inexcusable. Banjo the Fox. Excellently done first chapter, very enjoyable. Prologue and done, fuck that. Chapter 1. I'm both incredulous and impressed that you went from thoroughly entertained to dropping the story in one chapter. Sad to see you go, although I can't deny that it is kind of funny in a wonky sort of way. Color me curious, but where did I manage to turn you off so bad? As you can see, this quarantine really does have me reading every review. So toss a coin to your Witcher and send some more my way. Ah fuck it, have another cheeky excerpt below. I might make these a thing. Jaguar is always fun to write. Lessons with Jaguar, number 2. The darkness around him was indecipherable. The silence, intangible. The lack of sense, incomprehensible. The glowing yellow eyes of Jaguar 2-1 staring at him from the shadows in the far corner of the room was all Naruto had to focus on as he struggled not to slouch in exhaustion. The blood that was pooling around his feet, drooling from the various cuts and slashes across his body, was making it hard to not slip. The yellow eyes vanished and Naruto spun, adrenaline flooding his veins as his small fingers reached out and just barely clasped around the edges of the kunai that had come flying at him from the darkness. The boy winced, feeling sick to his stomach as he let the blade fall from his bleeding fingers. Clink. It fell, bouncing across the floor and disappearing into the hundreds of other kunai that surrounded him. A soft grunt echoed through the room. Good. There was a pause. At ease. Restraining the anguished cry, the masked boy fell to his knees with a dull thud. His minced hands reached for the floor, splashing into the blood as he struggled not to fall flat on his face. There was a flash of light and Naruto looked up to see Jaguar stood with a torch in his hand. Eyes locked on his student, the man slowly began to walk around the edges of the large underground room, lighting each of the wall sconces as he went. He had lit 3 before he finally spoke. Did you know that I have the chakra levels of a genin? He asked, almost as if he was discussing the weather. Naruto's head whipped up, exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he stared at his mentor. How the hell was that possible? He had read the man's mission reports, written in Jaguar's own hand. Every single mission, most of them conducted during war, had been the stuff of legend. Jaguar had even let him read the ones that reported how he had snuffed out S-rank shinobi like candles in the wind. How could he have done any of it with a genin's reserves? There was a faint crackling of embers as Jaguar lit the 4th torch. My pitiful chakra levels allowed me to become undetectable to the eyes of sensors. For all intents and purposes, to them I was invisible. But that was but a small advantage in the face of a colossal disadvantage. However, I could not fight for long. I could not use any powerful jutsu or genjutsu. Even Taijutsu was an uphill battle, since I could only fuel my muscles with chakra for so long before I run out of it. Naruto shook his head. It had to be a lie. The 5th torch came alight with a roar. Even still, I became a black Anbu. I became that which even Kage feared. His throat dry, his mouth bloodied and his lips cracked, Naruto still couldn't resist taking the bait. How? He asked. Jaguar lit the 6th torch. Well, I found a rather simple solution to it all, of course. Somehow, for some reason, Naruto knew that there was a smile beneath that mask. If I couldn't outlast my opponent, then I would not bother in trying to. He paused for a second, perhaps for dramatic effect. I would just butcher them very, very quickly. Naruto rocked back on his knees, confused. Jaguar chuckled. It was a low, thrumming sound that rattled around the room. I recognized my faults and turned them into strengths that stood unmatched. He lit the 7th torch. I mastered D and C rank ninjutsu, perfecting them to a point that none could mimic and used them against shinobi that could bathe entire villages in water and flame. I even created a new hand-to-hand combat style, one that focused not on flashy gimmicks or flowing combinations, but brutalizing and lethal strikes, each one capable of ending the fight, should it land cleanly. The final torch was lit and Jaguar tossed his own to the ground. He strode forward several paces and reaching into one of the pouches lining his waist, he withdrew a scroll. Speaking of which, realizing that his momentary grace period was now up, the boy dragged himself to his feet. His wounds that had somehow ceased bleeding in the short amount of time began to weep once more with the movement. He was forced to ignore them as Jaguar spoke, the snarling visage of his mask burning into Naruto's eyes. It's a simple style, but rather unique. You have 1 hour to read and understand it. And with that, he tossed the scroll to his student before abruptly vanishing into a somber scatter of ash and dust. Blinking, Naruto glanced down to the scroll in his hands and the title stamped in bold red that sealed it shut. Restricted by order of the Sandaime Hokage Forbidden Techniques. The Black Paw Procedure. Naruto found his curiosity piqued before he suddenly realized with a jolt how thick the scroll was. And he only had 1 hour to get through it all. What if Naruto has Lightning Panther summoning contract? Thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.